Hey there, and welcome to another episode of Cartridges and Casings, a whiplash of a military history live show. Today, I'm going to be having on Jim Gallagher. Jim is a retired U.S. Air Force colonel with a master's degree in both military history and operations management. Beyond his career as that, he was an international trade attorney. He's a dedicated volunteer at the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown and has lent his expertise as a film advisor for major productions like John Adams. We're honored to have his technical and historical perspective on the stream today, in which we are talking about Benedict Arnold. Quick housekeeping before we begin. Any and all questions will most likely be answered at the end, but I will be watching. So if you want to leave the questions in, I will be tracking that and we will get to those after the presentation. If you like this kind of content, please like, comment, subscribe, and know that this show will be happening on Sundays. All right, with that out of the way, let us begin. Jim, I've noticed a shift in how Benedict Arnold is viewed lately. Some modern historians are reframing his legacy, suggesting he was a talented soldier who felt backed into a corner by a difficult Congress, rather than just a simple villain. Do you agree with this more modern retelling of America's greatest villain?
I, Good evening, everybody, and thank you for having me, Luke. It's a pleasure to join with you from Yorktown this evening. Yeah, in terms of your question, I think what you said is true. There's been sort of a modern retelling of the Benedict Arnold story. Of course, after his defection to the British in 1780, he was his impact was minimized. And a lot of people tried to rewrite his life story, to his detriment. But unfortunately for Arnold, a lot of the things that they said were true. And the real truth of Arnold is that he kind of dug his own hole. He wasn't a very personable individual, and a lot of that was taken out on his fellow officers in the Continental Army. Congress felt his wrath from time to time. Certainly, the residents of Philadelphia and the Committee of Safety and the selectmen and the mayor of Philadelphia thought that he was a bad choice to be commissar there. So there's a lot in his background that that indicated that he was going to have a problematic stay in the Continental Army, and when you look at that, and that's what we want to do tonight. We want to look at that and look at how that really impacted his options as he got towards the end of the Revolutionary War.
Okay, and so just as a quick refresher, who is Benedict Arnold? Where does he come from? And then is he a general at the start of the war? If we could
That's a good place to start. So he's really Benedict Arnold the Fourth. Benedict Arnold II had been the governor of Rhode Island. The family then moved to Connecticut, to Norwich, Connecticut. Benedict Arnold III, his father, was a drunkard, and that's very, very well documented. He essentially squandered the family fortune. Benedict Arnold II had a number of children, but Benedict Arnold III got the lion's share of that inheritance, and he squandered it on essentially becoming a drunkard. And that's some of that. It shouldn't sell him too short, because he lost children at a very young age, and was devastated by that circumstance, and that kind of led to his drinking problem. But Benedict Arnold IV, of course, and his sister both survived to adulthood, and really became very dependent on each other. And we see that in the relationship between Benedict Arnold IV, our guy, and his sister, as not only as they grow up, but as they reach their maturity and during Arnold's time in the war. Arnold starts off the war as a captain of the Connecticut 2nd Foot Guards. He has about 120 men that are under his command. It was largely a ceremonial unit. They never did any fighting prior to the Revolutionary War. Arnold himself had never been engaged in combat before the Revolutionary War. There's some disagreement amongst historians about whether or not Arnold actually joined a New York militia outfit during the French and Indian War. But even if he did, which I think is probably true, he never saw any actual fighting. He was only in that organization for a couple of weeks. He was underage, and his father got him extracted from it. So he comes into the war as a captain of this ceremonial unit. They have very nice uniforms. They're used to escorting the governor around. And just a few days after April 19th, the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord, Arnold turns out his men and marches on the powder store at New London, which is under the care of a committee led by David Wooster, who is a Connecticut general at that point in time, and demands the keys to the powder magazine so that he can draw powder for his men, and really threatens to have his men barge into this committee of this war committee that's meeting under Wooster's guidance, and steal the keys. And rather than have violence ensue, Wooster just goes ahead and gives him the keys and lets him draw his powder. Now, the reason that they were meeting was because Massachusetts was not capable of absorbing all the men that Connecticut was sending north at that point in time, and they were trying to develop a staggered approach to feeding men into the perimeter of Boston. They would have to march from Connecticut up to Cambridge and then get inserted into the perimeter. So they were trying to organize that, and Arnold just, bull in a china shop, bowled his way through and got his powder and went ahead and marched north. It's about that time really that our story starts with him. So he starts off the war as a captain, and he marches north as a captain. Meanwhile, we have to turn our attention to what's actually going on up in Boston at that time. So we have the shot heard around the world on April 19th. Of course, the Minutemen and the Massachusetts militia essentially chase the Boston regulars in Boston the British regulars in Boston back into the perimeter of Boston. There's pretty much three axes of advance into or egress out of Boston. And the Patriots set up three individual camps at those three locations so that they control those axes of approach. And one of those, of course, is Dorchester Heights. Another's Charlestown Neck. So those are the two. And at this point we meet another Connecticut guy who is actually a real mover and shaker in Connecticut and has been for a while. His name is Gurdon Saltonstall. Gurdon Saltonstall was the son of the previous governor of Connecticut. Saltonstall has been a militia officer in Connecticut since the French and Indian War. He fought in the French and Indian War. He's an artillery officer and an engineer. And just before the Revolutionary War broke out, Saltonstall had been named the commander of the Connecticut artillery. So he was in charge of guns. And what that meant at that point in time is he had to actually find guns and get them mounted on carriages, because there wasn't a big artillery supply of artillery tubes in America at that point. Connecticut had actually had some guns. They were there, had been there since the French and Indian War for the defense of their coastal towns. And New London was one of the biggest fortress defenses that they had. And Saltonstall had been put in charge, and he had already gotten carriages for the guns in New London, and he knew how many there were. So when the fighting broke out on April 19th, Saltonstall immediately headed north, and he reached the Boston perimeter on the 21st of April. And we know this because he was sending letters back. He was sending letters back to the Connecticut Committee of Safety, as well as Governor Trumbull. And he surveyed what was going on up there from the perspective that Connecticut had artillery that might be able to contribute to the reduction of British forces within Boston. So he was looking at it from that perspective. And he was kind of avant-garde in his thinking, and recognized fairly early that the guns needed to be placed on, if guns were placed on Dorchester Heights, and guns needed to be placed on Dorchester Heights, that would command Boston Harbor and drive the British fleet away from Boston. And his thinking was that the soldiers would General Howe would get on board Lord Howe's navy to withdraw from London rather than be stranded there by the advent of guns on Dorchester Heights. So on the 25th of April, so we're just 6 days after the war has begun. On the 25th of April, Saltonstall starts to head back to Connecticut, and he headed back in the company of two gentlemen. One was Colonel Samuel H. Parsons. Parsons was a colonel of Connecticut militia, and he had been up there assessing the situation for the same reason that Saltonstall was. Parsons was writing back to David Wooster, explaining to him where the Connecticut forces were going to be needed and in what strengths they should be sent. And so Parsons was also a confidant, and he was on the Committee of Safety, the Connecticut Committee of Safety. So he had both a military and civil role in terms of the revolutionary governance. And I should say Connecticut was very well prepared. As a result of Trumbull's work prior to the war, Connecticut was very prepared for the outbreak of the war, probably the best prepared of any of the colonies, mostly because the governor of Connecticut, Jonathan Trumbull, was in favor of independence and was from the beginning. He's the only one of the colonial governors who stayed in power all the way through and in fact after the war. So he's the governor under the crown, and then he becomes the governor under the Articles of the Constitution, of Articles of Association, and then the Articles of Confederation, and then retires in 1784 from the governorship.
That's fascinating. So I have a question.
Yeah.
Is he appointed by the king or
yeah?
Is he
so initially he was a royal appointee, and the Trumbull family had been in Connecticut politics for a long time before he was appointed governor. He was a very logical choice for that. But his sentiments changed after the French and Indian War, and really probably about 1763 when the Proclamation line was established. Trumbull's affiliations changed dramatically. Also associated with that at the same time, Connecticut and Pennsylvania had Connecticut had this view of its constitution that it skipped over Pennsylvania, and Connecticut owned territory to the west of Pennsylvania, and Western Pennsylvania, of course, was also claimed that same area. So it's really the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania where Connecticut and Pennsylvania are sharing claim to that. And of course, the king comes down on the side of Pennsylvania, and that further alienated Trumbull's relationship with the crown. But the crown didn't replace him, and Trumbull worked really hard to maintain his relationship with the crown, not revealing his sentiment, and trying to be an effective mediator. And really, that's why the crown didn't relinquish him, because in many ways Trumbull was a mediator between the colony of Massachusetts and the crown. Trumbull knew that he could get messages to and from the crown and Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And the crown appreciated that, and Lord Germain appreciated that as well in London. So Trumbull was never relieved because of that. So that's one of the reasons that Connecticut is so well organized. So even a couple of days after the war's broken out, you have this conference of generals that's happening in New Haven. You have Connecticut already taking the time to figure out how to filter men effectively into the fray, and you understand logistics. That's the whole basis of this. You can't logistically support all these men that are collapsing on the Boston perimeter from all over New England. Massachusetts couldn't deal with it, and they're and we'll talk about that in a minute, how they handle some of it. So Saltonstall on the 25th starts to march home, and he's going with Parsons, and Parsons' aide-de-camp was a guy named Edward Mott. Edward Mott was the captain in the Connecticut militia, and he had accompanied Parsons and Saltonstall up to Boston to survey the situation. Edward Mott's brother, Samuel, was Saltonstall's deputy in the artillery. So Samuel has a very similar background to Saltonstall. He was also involved in the French and Indian War. He was also an engineer, and engineers and artillerymen shared a lot in common at this point in time. So these four guys are doing Connecticut's business, assessing the situation. So as they start to march home, Saltonstall writes a letter The letter is addressed to Silas Deane, and we all remember Silas Deane as a Continental Congressman, which he was at this point in time, but he was also on the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, along with some other people that we were going to learn about, Christopher Leffingwell. And anyway, there's sort of this group of people that are the central planners of Connecticut's military effort at this very early stage of the Revolutionary War. And in fact, they wouldn't even have called it a Revolutionary War at this point in time. They would have called it a civil disturbance, still seeking reconciliation with the crown. But anyway, this letter says, and it's kind of cryptic because he's not naming names, but he uses towns to represent people, and he says, the town of Norwich, which is where the Mott and Christopher Leffingwell are from. He uses Lebanon as a reference, and of course, Trumbull's headquarters is in Lebanon, Connecticut. He has what came to be called his war office, which was a barn in Lebanon, Connecticut, where he ran the war from. So Parsons talks about, in this letter of the 25th of April, Saltonstall says that he's aware of the plan from Lebanon and from Leffingwell, Deane, and Trumbull. He's aware of this plan that they've put forward, using their hometowns as disguised their names. He's aware of this plan that's putting forward, and he believes that the Committee of Safety should disavow themselves of this plan. And it's pretty clear that the plan he's talking about is getting the guns from Ticonderoga. He goes on to say that throughout this letter that the Dorchester Heights is the obvious place to mount these guns, that it will command the harbor and drive the British shipping from the harbor, and the presumption is that the troops will go with it, and rather than be left without the artillery support of the Royal Navy. He says that in the letter. And he gives two copies of the letter. He makes two copies. He gives one copy to Edward Mott, and he gives another copy to Samuel Parsons. Parsons takes the direct route to Hartford. They go through Worcester. They go, and then the party splits up after they go through Worcester. Parsons continues on directly towards Hartford, and Edward Mott and Saltonstall continue south to Preston, Connecticut, which is Saltonstall's home. That's where he's from. Once Edward Mott has successfully escorted him as far as Preston, the two split up. They spend the night at Saltonstall's house, and on the morning of the 27th, Edward Mott heads to Hartford and arrives there that afternoon. It's a distance of about 70 miles. I don't even think it's that far, probably 55 miles. So meanwhile, Parsons on the 26th has continued south into Connecticut, and there, marching north, he runs into Benedict Arnold on the road. And this is where the story of Fort Ticonderoga usually begins. It usually begins, and the Arnold apologists always started here. They ignore Saltonstall altogether and everything that Saltonstall has done, and the fact that there's already a plan in place from Connecticut to go to Fort Ticonderoga. And that plan dates back quite a ways. In February, I think February 13th of 1775, Samuel Adams commissions a guy named John Brown from the town of Pittsfield, Massachusetts, which is way out on the northwestern border of Massachusetts. He commissions this guy John Brown, who has just moved to that area. He's a young attorney. Sam Adams commissions him to go to Montreal and assess the sentiment among Canadians for how they would react in the Revolutionary, if in fact war broke out between the Americans and the British. And what John Brown does is he lives in Pittsfield. The first place he goes is to Salisbury, Connecticut. Salisbury is Ethan Allen's origin home. In fact, that's where Ethan Allen built the ironworks that is going to turn out over 300 cannon for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. Ethan Allen built that foundry. So the first place he does is he goes there. Then the next place he goes is to Albany, because he doesn't want to be marching through the New Hampshire grants without having consulted with the Committee of Safety in Albany, kind of asking permission. And the reason for that is Albany, New York, still claims the New Hampshire grants, Vermont, as its own property. And Brown doesn't want to be perceived as a Connecticut or as a Massachusetts spy traveling in another colony. So he goes to Albany to get the sense of the situation there. He tells the Committee of Safety in Albany that he's going to be making this trip through the New Hampshire grants up to Montreal. And then he launches on the trip. And it's a very arduous trip because there's an early thaw and the ice on Lake Champlain breaks up and his boat gets bogged down. But when he leaves Albany, the first place he goes to is Bennington, and he goes to the Catamount Tavern, which is Ethan Allen's headquarters. And he picks up a guide there. He picks up two guides, actually. One of them is Remember Baker, and the other is Peleg Sunderland, both of whom are, they're the left and right-hand mans of Ethan Allen operating in the New Hampshire grants in Vermont. And they guide him on a 2-week trip through Vermont. And during that 2-week trip, he meets Ethan Allen. They come to a consensus. Allen, according to Allen, Allen would say he told Brown that the Green Mountain Boys are ready to take Fort Ticonderoga at the first outbreak of hostilities. And then Brown, once he reaches Montreal, he writes a letter back to Sam Adams, and he tells him that. He says, to be kept a profound secret at the first outbreak of hostilities between us and Britain, it's imperative that we take Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point, and the inhabitants of the New Hampshire grants have agreed to do this, and they are the proper people for this task. And he writes that back to Sam Adams, and he sends a copy of that letter to our friend Jonathan Trumbull in Connecticut, which is still on file today with the Litchfield, Connecticut Society, Historical Society. So everybody knows about the one in Massachusetts, but they ignore the one in Litchfield. So he's telling both Connecticut and Massachusetts. And the reason that he's telling Connecticut is Ethan Allen is from Connecticut. And a lot of the settlers that have settled in the New Hampshire grants, these grants that have been issued by New Hampshire and are being contested by New York, a lot of these settlers are from Connecticut. So there's a machination that's in place. And in fact, on March 1st of 1775, so just a couple weeks after he's met John Brown, Ethan Allen wrote a letter to Oliver Walcott, who was another member of the Connecticut Committee of Safety. He's the sheriff of Litchfield County, Connecticut. And in this letter of March 1st, he tells Oliver Walcott that the Green Mountain Boys are going to side with the side for independence. Allen is very forward about it, and that they are prepared to take Fort Ty and Crown Point. So you've got these letters from Ethan Allen that are out there that pretty much already put them in charge. So now here we are back again. Parsons is marching south on the 26th of April, and he runs into to Benedict Arnold marching north at the head of his column of 2nd Connecticut Guards, and they have a conversation, and everybody agrees that they have a conversation. And there's some coyness about what was said in the conversation, and the coyness is because Connecticut doesn't want to get accused of invading New York, which is where Fort Ty is. But everybody agrees that they had this conversation. The Ethan Allen or the Benedict Arnold apologists will tell you that Arnold advised Parsons that there were guns available at Fort Ty and Crown Point. But you can't imagine that conversation taking place without some kind of prompting from Parsons. You don't just walk up and say, "Hey, Sam, there's some guns available at Fort Ty." Rather, it's almost, you have to understand what Parsons is doing. Parsons is carrying this letter from Saltonstall that says we need guns, and the best place to get them is Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point. And Parsons and Ethan Allen know each other. They've been in the Connecticut militia structure together. They've been in business together. They've been delegates to the Connecticut Assembly together. They know each other. So these are two familiar people meeting on the road and having a discussion. And undoubtedly, Parsons spilled the beans to him, and Benedict Arnold chimed in and said, "Yeah, there are guns up there. He hadn't been there a while himself, but he had contacts who were able to say, he was able to say, yeah, there's guns up there, and you could get them. And Parsons wants the guns from up there because he doesn't want to take them from New London. Saltonstall wants to keep the guns that are in New London because he's afraid of a naval assault on the coast of Connecticut. So this is all coming into place. Parsons goes on and he arrives in Hartford to the Committee of Safety, and it's debatable whether they're actually in Hartfield or Wethersfield, but they're right next door to each other, so it's almost Mott's next. The two towns are blended today. But Parsons calls a meeting of the Committee of Safety, and Leffingwell and Silas Deane meet him there, and they put their plan into motion. And the very next morning, on April 27th, a guy named two guys named Romans and Phelps leave the Hartford area and start to head towards Fort Ticonderoga. So the plan was well enough developed that they already had two people waiting there to put it in place. And what those two people do is Silas Deane and Christopher Leffingwell, Samuel Parsons, a total of 6 people, go and withdraw 300 pounds sterling of money from they take a loan from the Connecticut, the Crown. They basically borrow money from the Crown Treasury to fight a war against the Crown. It's pretty amazing, but they sign documents, they withdraw the money, and it's in coin. It's precious metals. It's specie, and they head off towards Vermont. So from there, you probably know the story. They first go to meet with Ethan Allen's relatives in Western Connecticut. Then they find out that Ethan is keeping his family in Massachusetts, where they're safe from New York, where they won't be assaulted by the New York sheriff. They moved him to a house not too far from Pittsfield. So they head for Pittsfield, where they meet Ethan Allen's family. And in the process, they meet this Colonel John Easton, who is the colonel of the Western Massachusetts militia. And Easton introduces them to this guy, John Brown, who's just done the survey of the New Hampshire grants and gone to Montreal and written this letter to Samuel Adams. So the group of them recruits some soldiers there, probably between 60 and 70 soldiers, and they start marching north. Meanwhile, back in Hartford, the following morning, on the afternoon of the 27th, Edward Mott arrives carrying the second copy of the letter from Saltonstall, and he basically tells the committee the same thing. And then the committee slyly asks him, because evidently Mott wasn't part of the in group, that they ask Mott if he would be willing to take on command of this expedition, because right now he's the only military officer who they've dealt with. Phelps and this guy Romans are not military officers. And so by putting a military officer in charge, now you don't have the issue of potential spying being done by Romans and Phelps. It takes them out of the equation. And of course, Connecticut wants the Green Mountain Boys to do this because it keeps them out of suspicion of invading another colony. New York thinks that the New Hampshire grants belong to them. They think that Ethan Allen is a New Yorker. That's their official position. So if you get Ethan Allen to take the guns at Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point, this is New York on a New York. This isn't Connecticut or Massachusetts invading another colony. And of course, their ideas of sovereignty at that point were pretty strict in terms of what you do with other colonies. And so far, the Continental Association was a pretty loose association. We had agreed on an embargo, but we didn't have a federation, a true confederation of colonies at this point. So, and you have the other problem that Connecticut and Massachusetts had been fighting border wars with New York for decades. There was a dispute about where the actual eastern border of New York laid. Connecticut and Massachusetts, as well as New Hampshire, which is why they issued the New Hampshire grants. Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire all thought that the eastern border of New York laid along the lines of a treaty that was signed between the Dutch and the New England governors in 1642 during the Pequot Wars, where the Dutch claimed 10 miles east of the Hudson River as the eastern boundary of New York. However, the Crown had been the New York governors have been slowly creeping eastward with their claims of boundary. And of course, modernly, it's much farther east than that. But there had been border wars and the border wars were because people from New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Massachusetts had laid claims to the western sides of their domain that New York was then saying our New York territory. And in order for Connecticut settlers' claim to be validated, they had to surrender, according to New York, they had to surrender their claim and then apply to New York to be issued the same claim again and pay the fees all over again, just as though they were initially buying the territory or buying the land. And so it was really painful for settlers, and it resulted in border wars. So you had this real standoffish, nobody, the New England colonies did not want to piss off New York. They wanted to stay as pristine as they could, but at the same time, they needed those guns to fight the battle at Boston. So you can see where this is going, where they really want Ethan Allen to do this job for them and to gain the benefits of what they perceive as a New York on New York, something that New York really can't complain about because they're laying claim to Ethan Allen in the first place. So all that is set in motion, and Mott goes off. He immediately leaves Hartford the next morning on the 28th and catches up to Phelps and Romans in Pittsfield. And then they go on together from that point. And by the time they cross the border into the New Hampshire grants into what's modernly Vermont, they've got probably around 70 men that are with them between the Connecticut contingent, which has swelled as they went across the state, and then the militia guys that Easton calls up and starts to march north with. So they cross into Vermont on the 2nd of May. All right, and that's kind of an important date for the rest of this story. So what does this have to do with Ethan Allen or Benedict Arnold? That's what we're really talking about. So after Arnold meets Parsons on the road, he leads his Connecticut contingent up towards Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he's hoping to be put in the line in the siege of Boston. And of course, he gets there, and the Massachusetts Committee of Safety says, "Hey, we told the generals down in Connecticut that we can't take any more troops. So you need to take your guys home until we're ready for you, and then we'll call you forward." So Massachusetts essentially rejects him, and that's a kind of a crushing blow for him. Arnold is he's really seeking to overcome, and all of his life, he has sought to overcome his father's reputation, his father's squandering of the family fortune, his father's reputation as a drunkard, the collapse of the family business. Arnold has been struggling to overcome this, and he sees his way out as glory in war. So getting rebuffed by Massachusetts, it's like persona non grata. But instead of going home, the next day he comes back, he writes him a letter and says, "I've got a plan." If he starts off the letter by saying, you should be informed that there are a bunch of guns available, heavy artillery that's available at Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point on the shores of Lake Champlain. And he delivers the letter in person, and we don't know exactly what he told the Committee of Safety, because the Committee of Safety of Massachusetts at that point is severely depleted. And that's because the significant members of the Massachusetts Committee of Safety have already left to go to Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress, which is supposed to convene on the 9th of May. In fact, as Edward Mott is leaving Hartford, John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Robert Treat Paine all arrive in their carriages to Hartford to confer with the Connecticut Committee of Safety prior to going on to Philadelphia. So they're there the next day. And that evening, the evening of the 28th or the morning of the 29th, John Adams sends a letter back saying that there's a significant expedition underway in Connecticut that you need to be aware of, and the bearer is supposed to tell him that. He doesn't put it into writing in case it's intercepted by the British, but pretty clearly he's writing to him about the Connecticut's expedition to Fort Ticonderoga. So that is happening on the morning of 29th. So that letter has not yet reached Cambridge, where the Committee of Safety is meeting, and Massachusetts knows nothing about this from the Connecticut sources yet. So Arnold tells them he's got this brilliant plan to take troops to Fort Ticonderoga, capture the guns, and bring them back to Boston, which is exactly what Saltonstall's letter had said should be done. And he sells it to the senior guy that's still there on the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, which is Joseph Warren. And Warren, as we know, is killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So he's, when all of this blows up later on, Warren's not around to state what actually happened. So we never get an actual account from Warren on what Arnold said. But Massachusetts doesn't immediately respond to him. That night, Warren sends a letter to the Committee of Safety in Albany, saying that it has come to our attention that there's guns at Fort Ticonderoga. We think that they should be secured for the Patriot cause, and let us know your opinion on that. He doesn't come right out and say, I want to send a force up there. He wants to know Albany's opinion, the Albany Committee of Safety's opinion on this. And the reason that's problematic is that there's a schism between Albany and New York City. New York City, there's a lot of loyalists in New York City, and the Committee of Safety for New York City is not fully on board with the events that have happened in Massachusetts on April 19th. Albany is more on side. They're ready to rock and roll, but they don't control the whole state. Albany County, which the Committee of Safety for Albany County extends all the way north from just below Albany all the way up to the Canadian border. So they're really in charge of the area that Fort Ticonderoga was in at that point in time. So Warren sends this letter, and then apparently started thinking about it and realized that time was of the essence and he wasn't going to wait. So on the 2nd of May, of course, there's a weekend that's interposed here where, they all do go to church, and church is an all-day thing. So on 2nd May, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety all meet together, excepting for the people that have gone on to Philadelphia for the Continental Congress. They meet, and you start to see in the Massachusetts Committee of Safety minutes where they're starting to put things together, and they call upon the logisticians of Massachusetts to prepare 200 pounds sterling, 300 pounds or 100 pounds of gunpowder, 100 pounds of lead. They're trying to put the supplies together to supply what is going to end up being the Massachusetts expedition. And by the 3rd of May, they draft a colonel's commission for Benedict Arnold. They've selected him to head this expedition, and the Arnold's commission, which again is in the minutes of the Committee of Safety, essentially says you are to raise a regiment of not exceeding 400 men, and upon raising that regiment, to proceed through the New Hampshire grants to attack the fortress at Fort Ticonderoga, capture the guns, and begin to ship them back to the Boston perimeter. So Arnold is supposed to gather up a regiment of 400 men. And what happens is he doesn't do that. He's got 100 and some odd men at his beck and call, because the 1st and Connecticut Guards companies are both in the Boston perimeter, and both have been told to go home, and they haven't yet. They're still there. So he has instant access to over 100 men who could go on this march, who would fall under his command as a Connecticut captain, militia captain. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he seizes the still wet commission, jumps on his horse. There's some debate whether he takes an enslaved servant with him. Peleg Sunderland later says that he did. But he starts heading for Western Massachusetts and Vermont. And of course, he's going to get there in 6 days, which is just a phenomenal ride at that point in time. So he goes first to Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And you have to wonder why he goes to Pittsfield. because that's where John Brown is from. So he's connecting the dots. So you have to know that he's been privy to. Parsons had let him in on the secret of what they had planned for the attack on Fort Ticonderoga, because he leaves without a single man in his command, and he doesn't stop to collect any on the way. He gets to Pittsfield, finds out that he's missed the Connecticut group. They're already in Vermont. Remember, they crossed the border in Vermont the 3rd of May. He gets to Pittsfield on the 6th, and then immediately turns and the next morning and starts to head north. He has to change horses there because he's worn out his horse, and he's not waiting for anybody. He's not trying to collect men. He writes a letter to Albany requesting that they informing them that he's got a commission from Massachusetts to reduce the fort at Ticonderoga. He's not being diplomatic at all. He writes to Albany and orders them to collect provisions for 1,000 men and send it to Fort Ticonderoga. So he's clearly in on the plan. He knows Parsons probably told him exactly what they were planning, and he's headed to Fort Ticonderoga. And of course, he arrives there on the evening of the 9th of May. Now, there's a story, and you'll read about it a lot in a lot of the Arnold modern apology books, that Arnold arrives at Castleton, where the Green Mountain Boys and the Connecticut and Massachusetts militia are assembling. What has happened is on the day of the 8th of May, all of those forces came together at Castleton, Vermont, and they start to send out feelers. They send one troop off towards Skenesboro, which is the bottom of Lake Champlain. A guy named Philip Skene has a large business there. He owns thousands of acres. He has an ironworks that are north of Lake Champlain. He has an iron furnace there at the bottom of Skenesboro, and that's the place that the boats and ships, the ore barges and the schooners and brigs that ply Lake Champlain, they're built there. He has a boat works there. So that's an important place. In fact, later on, because it becomes the birthplace of the American Navy under Philip Schuyler, it gets renamed Whitehall after the British, the site of British Naval Command. So Ethan Allen, so all of these forces under Edward Mott as the designated Connecticut commander. Romans has departed the party for a week or so, but Phelps, Peleg Sunderland, Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys, they've got 160 or so troops gathered there. Ethan Allen has collected the most, and what they do is they decide that they're going to have a council of war, and there's a fairly typical thing in the 18th century where the senior commanders get together and they discuss their plan of action. So this council of war, Edward Mott is the chairman, because he's the only, for them, he's the only military commander that has been assigned to this detachment. He's the chairman of this committee of war, and they all get together, and there's this. So Easton has brought about 60 guys. The Connecticut group has brought about 15 or 20 guys. Ethan Allen has collected nearly 100. And what they decide is that the privilege of command is going to go to the person the commander who has brought the most troops, and that's Ethan Allen. So Ethan Allen is, the committee of war agrees that Ethan Allen is going to be the commander, which is also fitting because he has the best knowledge of the area. Probably of that group of people, he was probably the only one who had actually been inside Fort Ticonderoga, at least from the command's perspective. So they've sent off some people to go who actually go in the fort. Phelps's brother goes and reconnoiters inside the fort under the pretense of coming in from the frontier and needing a haircut and a shave. And he goes in and scouts the fort. They send off another troop down to Skenesboro. They send another group to the shores of Lake Champlain to make sure that they've got enough boats to get across. So after the war council is over, Ethan Allen leaves, and he follows down to the shores of Lake Champlain to help organize the boats, because he's well known in the area and people respond to him. He's the firebrand that raises troops in Vermont. So he leaves, and he's gone by the time Benedict Arnold arrives. In fact, probably has about a 5-hour head start on Arnold. So when Arnold arrives, he shows up alone, no troops, But he whips out this piece of paper from the Massachusetts Committee of Safety up till now has not been involved in this at all. This has been a completely Connecticut-driven operation. And Arnold whips out this piece of paper and says, "I'm in charge. Massachusetts says I'm in charge." And these guys from Connecticut and Vermont say, "But the hell you are. You didn't bring any troops, and we don't think you have the potential to raise any, because everybody up here is forming under Ethan Allen, or the people from Western New York fall under Colonel Easton, who is a militia colonel. So he's got a commission too." And then John Brown has a claim by virtue of having been hired months before by Massachusetts as their territorial scout. So they just tell Arnold, "No, you're not." And there's a fracas that breaks out. Arnold keeps insisting on his command, but there's this apocryphal story that Ethan Allen and Arnold had this confrontation at Castleton, and it doesn't happen because Allen wasn't even there when Arnold arrives. So Arnold decides that he's not going to abide by the decision of the Council of War. They head down to the lake, where they find Ethan Allen, and really Ethan Allen doesn't get enough credit because his temperament was, he's just as obnoxious as Arnold was. His temperament probably wouldn't have put up with much of that, but he calms it and just says, "Look, we'll march through the wicket together." So they do, and they go and take Fort Ticonderoga. So the problem erupts when both of them, and there's a picture of Ethan Allen. That's actually Lieutenant Feltwell, not Captain Delaplace. Captain Delaplace was the commander of Fort Ticonderoga. Lieutenant Feltwell was one of his deputies. When Arnold knocks on the door, he knocks on the barracks door where Feltwell lives instead of Delaplace. Feltwell answers the door. He doesn't have his britches on yet. He says, "Under whose command are you, demanding my surrender?" And Ethan Allen very bombastically says, and that they have this in reverse because Feltwell says that Allen held the sword over his head. Allen says, "On behalf of the great Jehovah and Continental Congress." At least that's what Allen claims that he said. I think that was probably crafted over years of retelling the story. But anyway, that's what he wrote in his book. So they capture it. The next day, Ethan Allen sends a detachment on to to Crown Point to capture Crown Point under the command of Seth Warner. You probably recognize the Seth Warner, or at least revolutionary interested people will recognize the name Seth Warner as the man who takes over. Was one of Ethan Allen's deputies, and then after Ethan Allen is captured in outside of Montreal, Seth Warner takes over command of the Green Mountain Boys, and then becomes commander of the Green Mountain Regiment, Seth Warner's independent regiment that is formed under the auspices of New York. So Warner goes off to capture Crown Point, and does. So the next day, Ethan Allen sends a letter he sends a letter to Connecticut. He also sends a letter to Massachusetts, to the committees of safety, informing them of the capture of the fort. He sends a letter to Albany, letting them know as well. But only in the Albany letter does Allen mention Arnold's name, and only to the point of saying that Arnold marched in at his left hand as they took the fort. Doesn't mention Arnold to the Committee of Safety from Connecticut, and he doesn't really mention. He mentions that Arnold's there, but he doesn't give Arnold credit for doing anything when he writes to the Massachusetts Committee of Safety. And of course, he realizes he has to write to the Massachusetts Committee of Safety because he's got Easton, Brown, and now he's got Arnold all in tow from Massachusetts. So he informs them all, and he delegates different people to carry those letters south. He sends Edward Mott with a letter to Connecticut, and he sends Colonel Easton from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, the Massachusetts militia colonel, to Cambridge to inform the Massachusetts Committee of Safety. Arnold, of course, writes his own letters, and he takes credit for the whole thing. He outlines that under his command, the Green Mountain Boys with Ethan Allen have, and to Arnold doesn't mention Ethan Allen. He just says the Green Mountain Boys under his command took Ticonderoga. So there's this, this tug of war that's happening for command here, and it's this tug of war that becomes the crux of Massachusetts disgust, for lack of a better word, with Arnold. So the letters have gone back. The Massachusetts Committee of Safety, Joseph Warren gets that letter saying that Fort Ty is ours. And a day later, he gets another letter saying that we've successfully captured Crown Point. And unfortunately, Arnold misfires on his letter of the 11th. On the 11th, Arnold sends another letter to the Massachusetts Committee of Safety and to the Continental Congress, informing them that the party that he ordered to go take Crown Point has this day turned back due to weather. And what Arnold obviously didn't understand was that it was already in the possession of Seth Warner by that point. He already had control. So Arnold sends a letter back saying his party was turned back from Crown Point. And on the same day, Ethan Allen sends a letter to Massachusetts saying Seth Warner has successfully captured Crown Point, which was the truth. Arnold then sends another letter saying that his men who took Skenesboro, what modern day Whitehall, have arrived in the sloop that they captured in Skenesboro, which of course is another lie, because Arnold had already, Ethan Allen had already detached a group to Skenesboro who had successfully captured Skenesboro. So all of this is coming together, and Arnold's getting caught on a whole bunch of lies that he's telling the Massachusetts Committee of Safety. And so after they get the letters of the 11th and they realize that this is happening, and now they've gotten a letter from the Committee of Safety in Connecticut, and they've gotten John Adams' letter saying that this was going to happen and it's being organized by Connecticut, Massachusetts Committee of Safety, Joseph Warren, decides that Connecticut has the lead, and they should take over the responsibility for maintaining and sending troops to Fort Ty. And they send a letter to Arnold telling him that he's to cease and desist, that Connecticut's taking this over. And they don't have, thank you for your contribution and your efforts, but Connecticut's going to lead this charge from here on out, because they don't have time. They're dealing with Boston. Their hands are full, and they explain that to Arnold. So Arnold doesn't get that letter until like the 23rd or 25th of May. And by then, he's already gone reconnoitering up towards St. John's in the schooner. He's, basically taken it off of Ethan Allen's hands and expropriated it, and sailed up to Fort St. John's, and he's been inside the fort. He's captured the fort, and then realizes that there's more British. He only was traveling with about 20 or 25 or 30 troops. He realizes that there's British regulars that are headed south towards Fort John. Fort John didn't even know that the war had started. They had not heard of Lexington and Concord yet, so it was a completely surprise. They basically walk in and go, "You're prisoners of war." And this very small garrison surrenders to him. He captures the other ship that's up there, and decides that he's going to abandon Fort John because he can't hold it with the number of troops that he has. He's not effective. And on his way, just barely leaving the mouth of the Richelieu River, he runs into Ethan Allen coming north with about 100 men to do the same thing. So you can tell how disorganized this is. And the big mistake is right there. Had the two of them turned around and gone back with a force of about 150, they could have easily held Fort John against the regular reinforcements that were coming south. But instead, because of the animosity that's going on between these two would-be commanders, they decide not to hold it. So that chance is lost, and it later, later on, after it's reinforced, becomes a significant battle to retake the fort. So what's happened here is that Arnold's caught in a whole series of lies. He's caught in that first lie where he tells the Massachusetts Committee of Safety that this is my idea. And of course, very quickly they learn that it's not his idea. Joseph Warren knows that it's not his idea. So Joseph Warren is almost let off the hook, if you would, by the fact that Connecticut writes to him and says, "We're going to do this," and he can go, "Okay, you guys take it over. Yeah, it's your job." And he backs out of it, and he tells Arnold, that they're turning this over to Connecticut. And of course, Connecticut does respond. They get 1,000 men under a colonel named Hinman, who is already marching towards Boston. They divert him and head him out towards Fort Ticonderoga, and he gets there in about 4 weeks' time. So he's going to get there in early June to take over. and he does take over. Um, uh, but Arnold has told all these other lies. After he's up there, he's sending lies about what he has done, and his letters are getting there after Ethan Allen's letters. So they already know that Ethan Allen has done this, and Ethan Allen has sent them with representatives that can talk responsible and believable representatives who can tell Massachusetts Committee of Safety, what has truthfully happened up there. And so they do. And so Arnold is caught in this series of lies. And of course, after Joseph Warren is killed, it's not until after Joseph Warren is killed that the different parties start to try to sort out who actually did what. And to Connecticut's credit, they downplay it, and they just say, yeah, we met. Parsons writes a letter. He says, yeah, I met Ethan Allen on the road, and we discussed candidates in Fort Ticonderoga. And he doesn't say anything further than that. He just downplays the whole thing, tries to defuse the situation. But the problem was that Sam Adams, John Adams, Payne, Silas Dean, Trumbull, all those people, those members of the Massachusetts delegation to Continental Congress and the Connecticut delegation to the Continental Congress know that Arnold has told this lie. Even though Warren doesn't survive the Battle of Bunker Hill, these major players in Continental Congress all know what truthfully happened. And throughout the course of the war, you see Arnold getting put up for positions of prominence within Continental Congress and getting negative votes from his home colony, his home state, and Massachusetts. And it's because of this. He's getting nay votes. You see in 1779, Arnold is put up to be the Commissioner of Ordnance for the Continental Army, which would have been a plum for him. And the Continental Congress goes through nominations, and 5 names are nominated. And in the official record of Continental Congress, Arnold's name is the first name, and it's struck through. And it's struck through on the motion from John Adams. And they're just not supporting him. And so he's swimming upstream already. And it's just a result of what has happened, what the lies that he has told to ingratiate himself in Fort Ticonderoga. And of course, the modern Arnold biographers don't start the story with Gurdon Saltonstall and what Gurdon Saltonstall was doing in Cambridge. And so they miss the outset of Connecticut's plan for Fort Ticonderoga. And because you miss that, and you start with the meeting, they start with the meeting of Parsons and Arnold on the road, there's no background to the story that reveals to you that Connecticut has a plan in motion. And, Parsons is basically asking Arnold for advice on will we be successful or not, and then Arnold extrapolates that into this lie that he has to live with for the rest of his war. So that's kind of the end of our the Ticonderoga episode.
So that's crazy that he came out the bat and his lies are going to follow him the entire career. Yeah. People don't forget.
Yeah, he has to live with that. It's really the first shovel full of dirt.
Well, did he just have I guess you were I'm wondering if you're if he's a habitual liar at that point, or if that's just he messed up early and could never write it back, or
I think he got in a position where he couldn't walk it back. Too many people knew about it. He really wasn't able to walk it back, and so there's this series of letters, and he's, his letter to Albany is days after Albany receives a letter from Connecticut advising him the same thing, and so he's just he's behind, and he didn't realize it at the time that he was doing it, that he was behind, and that he was going to get caught out. I don't know if he considered that as a possibility, but this was an age of integrity and honor, and that alone should have precluded him from doing that, or whether he legitimately thought that his Massachusetts commission gave him command over forces raised in other colonies, and that's a long stretch, because it isn't until Continental Congress on the 14th of June, votes to have a continental army and to take over the Army of Observation outside of Boston. It is until that date that a continental army exists. Until that point in time, until George Washington arrives outside of Boston as the assigned Congress's assigned commander of the Continental Army, it isn't until George Washington arrives that there is command of a person from one colony over forces of another. The forces from Connecticut that go to Massachusetts stay under the command of Connecticut officers. The forces from Massachusetts stay in command of Massachusetts officers. The only people that integrate are forces from New Hampshire and the New Hampshire grants that respond to the Lexington alarm, and that's because there's so few of them that it doesn't make sense for them to have a separate command. But otherwise, everybody stays under their own command, well into the summer of 1775. There's no precedent for Arnold to have claimed command over forces raised in another colony.
Well, he definitely believed in himself. You can say that.
He was a bombastic personality. He did have a penchant for lying, and if you follow his correspondence, if you look in the Force archives, the American archives, and just read the correspondence, you can often see Arnold writing letters to different people where he tells one person one thing and another person another thing, or he highlights different aspects that generally go to his advantage depending on his relationship with the recipient. He's like that. He tells what he needs to tell to put himself first and to take advantage of any given situation. And of course, we're going to talk about a few other episodes where he does the same thing.
Yeah, I was about to say, if anyone has any questions right now, you can put them out there. Welcome to Top Lobsters, 6 Oliver, and then Stock Investor. So Jim, where do you want to take the story next?
Well, really, when we look at Arnold's career, the next thing that comes to light, it's not the next thing that happens, but it's the next thing that comes to light. And the next thing that comes to light is the Moses Hazen episode, which occurs as the American forces are departing from Canada. So we know that Montgomery gets Philip Schuyler, as commander of the North, decides that we should invade Canada. And of course, we've put out feelers up there. And so in the summer of 1775, we start to assemble forces under the guidance of Schuyler at Fort Ticonderoga. It's a staging point to march north to Montreal. And of course, they march north in the fall, take Fort St. Jean at the northern end on the Richelieu River, the egress river from Lake Champlain, which enables them to control the north of the lake and the Richelieu River. And then from Fort St. Jean, they go on to Sorel, Three Rivers, and then capture Montreal. Meanwhile, while that's going on, Benedict Arnold, who is now without a command because Massachusetts has relieved him, and I've skipped over a lot of what happens at Fort Ty, with Arnold leaving, because it's not germane to the point of, it just adds more weight to Arnold's disgrace there. But Arnold leaves, and he's not able to get an audience in Massachusetts now. Massachusetts turns down. He goes back to Cambridge and wants to. They've revoked his commission as a colonel. He's no longer a colonel in Massachusetts, and we don't know exactly why that happens, but we can guess. He's not able to get an audience with Trumbull in Connecticut to be appointed as a Connecticut officer, and he surrendered his command of the 2nd Foot Guards, in order to traipse off to Fort Ty. So he doesn't have a command anymore in Connecticut. So instead, he goes to Cambridge, arriving a month or so after Washington arrives, and ingratiates himself with Washington. And of course, the gazettes have printed some of Arnold's version of Fort Ty, that he's the hero of Fort Ty. And so he comes in, when he meets Arnold, he carries that laurel with him, that he was part of the Joint Command at Fort Ty. And Washington looks at him as, an energetic officer. And I'm sure Arnold tells Washington his version of, why the Fort Ty expedition was launched. And so, Washington, he successfully ingratiates himself with Washington over the course of about 5 weeks. Washington is already pondering an eastward attack on Quebec City to dovetail with the attack on Montreal. because Washington, you know, as a military leader, realizes that the British have forces in Quebec City, and if they aren't tied down, they're gonna go, you know, upriver up the St. Lawrence to Montreal to reinforce Montreal. So he wants to have that second front opened, and he hires Arnold, or he gives Arnold the command of the expedition, which goes up the Kennebec River, stages at Augusta, Fort Augusta was now Augusta, Maine, and they proceed, you know, through the wilderness, literally through the wilderness, towards Quebec. So that's happening, and we have something to say about that, but it doesn't become public. The next thing about Arnold that becomes public is the withdrawal from Quebec. The next problem, the next shovel full of dirt that Arnold digs in his own hole, comes as a result of the withdrawal from Canada, which is going to happen a year later, well, not quite a year later, 8 months later, in June of 1776. So Arnold marches to Quebec, and as we know, the attacking force on Quebec is decimated, you know, in the streets of Quebec. There was a great picture there, Jeffrey's depiction of that. And this is a little bit wrong. They do have some street fighting like this with people firing out the windows, but the big thing that thwarts the American attack is they round the corner, and Governor Carleton has, the commander of the British forces there, has set up a 16-pound cannon in the street and loaded with double grape shot. And as the American forces come around the corner of the street and head towards the main gate of Fortress Quebec, they're literally at the mouth of the gun when Carleton gives the order to fire. And that double grape shot decimates the American forces. It inflicts over 70 casualties in one single cannon blast. You know, Montgomery is at the lead of the charge, and his almost at the mouth of the cannon, his head just disintegrates. They don't even ever find the top half of his body. It's a hideous defeat. Of course, Arnold doesn't see that. He is wounded before they got to that point. In fact, this might be a depiction of the wounding of Arnold. He's shot in his left leg and has to be carried off the field. So the Americans have to wait outside the gates of Quebec for, you know, the entire winter under Arnold's command. It doesn't go well. They're forced to withdraw. They withdraw back down to Montreal, fighting, you know, sort of they're not really fighting a delay, but they do have a little battle at Sorel on their way back down. Anyway, they fall back to Montreal. And the army by this point in their winter quarters gets decimated by smallpox. What was supposed to be a 6,000-man force in Canada has dwindled down to less than 3,000. And some of the enlistments are running out, and troops start to go home. The situation's getting desperate. They're out of money. They're trying to pay the Canadians for logistical support with essentially paper money. The Continental Congress hasn't started printing money yet, so they're trying to pay them essentially with chits, with IOUs, and the Canadians are not having any of that. They see what's happening. They know that the army's dwindling, that this campaign in Canada is failing. So to get to the bottom of what is really happening in Canada, Continental Congress sends a delegation up to Canada, and they send Ben Franklin, who you see seated there, great picture. They say Ben Franklin. They send Charles Carroll, who's from Maryland, who you see speaking here to the Canadian delegation. Charles is on the left with his hand open there. They send Charles because he's Catholic, and they think that having a Catholic talk to the Catholic Canadians, the French Canadians, would be a sign of religious tolerance, which so far the 13 colonies have been pretty intolerant. Even at this point, Maryland has been forced to become a Protestant colony. It's no longer a Catholic colony. And behind Charles Carroll is Samuel Chase. Samuel Chase was a great pick because not only is he also from Maryland and also a Catholic, but both Carroll and Chase had been partners with Benedict Arnold in trading enterprises in the Caribbean, and they knew each other. And at this point, Arnold is not quite, he's kind of the acting commander in Canada because General Thomas has come down with smallpox. And Thomas is going to die a few weeks later. And then the fourth person on the left side is Chase's brother-in-law, who was a Catholic priest in Maryland. And he was sent to talk to the Canadian Monsignors, as a sort of religious to religious, to let them know that, Catholicism is tolerated in the lower 13 colonies, because they really want Quebec to be the 14th American province at this point. So this negotiation is trying to keep the door open for Quebec becoming the 14th province. And unfortunately for them, we're not ready for that one yet. Unfortunately for them, the Boston papers about 2 months before had printed some of the debates that had happened in Continental Congress regarding the Quebec Act. And of course, the Quebec Act extended or returned the right to openly practice Catholicism to not only to Quebec, but to the extended area of Quebec, which the Quebec Act, the British Parliament granted to Quebec. So under Parliament's Quebec Act, Quebec now extends all the way down to the junction of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, and what used to be called the Northwest Territory. In particular, this is really angering for the Virginia delegation because Virginia claimed most of that territory. So the Boston papers had published that debate, and it's really unfortunate because the debate happened it happened in the fall of 1774 at the First Continental Congress, but those papers had made it to Montreal a couple weeks before the congressional delegation arrived. So the Canadians had been reading about this religious disposition or the religious intolerance in Continental Congress prior to this delegation arriving. So they weren't really receiving them. So the debate doesn't go well. The commissioners end up staying there. There's several letters from the commissioners back to Continental Congress. There's letters from Arnold, from Thomas, from the various generals that are up there back and forth with Continental Congress and with the command structure of the Continental Army. And Continental Congress, the commissioners have a lot of authority. They've been given authority over both the military and they've been given authority to negotiate with the Canadians. And what they find is that the American Army is desperately short of supplies. So they tell the American Army, Arnold's essentially a deputy commander and sort of the acting commander at this point, that we want the Canadians to stay on side. And we want to keep this door open to Canada becoming the 14th province. And it's going to take more negotiation. And we realize that it's not going to be a function of military conquest. It's going to have to be negotiation. So we don't want to upset the Canadians. So in your quest for provisions for the Army, you have to give them, if you have currency, you have to give them specie. If you don't have specie, you have to give them letters of credit that will be, that we will repay once. And Congress is already negotiating for loans from Holland and European powers. So they think they're going to get these loans to pay off these debts. And so they tell them, give good letters of credit, give good IOUs, and don't take anything that is not for military purpose. You can take food supplies, you can take shoes, you can take blankets, you can take cloth for uniforms, but you can't take furniture. You can't take brassware. You can't take art. None of this, possessions, personal possessions are off limits. You can't, just take them because they belong to Canadian loyalists. Those people are going to come back and tell stories. You can't alienate these people. We want them to be on side. So Congress leaves, the delegation leaves, and then it's a few weeks later when, I guess it's 2 months later, when the actual withdrawal from Canada happens. And as the withdrawal is happening, the Americans head south from Montreal. They go to Three Rivers, which is an island just above St. John's. It's in the Richelieu River, and then they're going to board some boats to take them to the falls at St. John's, and then march from St. John's down to Lake Champlain. And then Philip Schuyler has arranged for 1,000 bateaux to meet them at the mouth of at the northern end of Lake Champlain, which are going to carry them back to Crown Point and Fort Ticonderoga. So as they march south, St. John's, the fort at St. John's, is at the homestead of Moses Hazen. Moses Hazen was an American. He fought in the French and Indian War. He'd been in Rogers Rangers. In fact, he had a horrible reputation in Rogers Rangers as really a brutalist. And then at the end of the French and Indian War, he ended up joining the 44th Regiment of Foot as a Canadian, and he had a British commission. In fact, he was still on half pay as a retired British officer. I think it's a major in the British Army. I could be wrong on that. He might have been a captain. Anyway, he's set up his homestead near St. John's, and the reason that he has is after the French and Indian War, he did business in Canada. He met a Canadian woman, a Catholic, and he knew that she wouldn't be accepted in Massachusetts, a Puritan, Protestant society. So he decided to stay and create a homestead near Fort St. John. And he owned thousands of acres there, a very going concern. He was raising cattle and horses. And on their way back south, so he and Arnold have already had a run-in at the Battle of the Cedars. The Battle of the Cedars is sort of on that tip of land that extends into the St. Lawrence Seaway that is due west of Montreal. It's a little peninsula there, and the Cedars actually were an island. But the Battle of the Cedars, a large number of Americans were captured there, and Arnold wanted to mount a counterattack to recapture the Americans. And Hazen, who knew the local, the First Nation warriors, he advised Arnold that wouldn't succeed, that you wouldn't be able to sneak up on these guys and recapture these hostages, that if they sensed you were coming to recapture the hostages, they would just kill the hostages and retreat into the woods, and you would end up completely empty-handed. So, and at the Council of War, where Moses Hazen presents that idea, the rest of the officers agree with him. Fellow Canadians, advise Arnold the same thing, so they don't do it. They don't counterattack. So during the countermarch, they get down to St. John's, and Arnold tells Moses Hazen that he has to kill all of his livestock, because if he doesn't, it's going to fall into British hands and support the British. And it's kind of one of those things. Yeah, it's legitimate, but this is private property. It's not like he's telling him to kill somebody else's livestock, and he doesn't give him an option to have the livestock driven off somewhere else. He tells him he has to kill him, and Hazen has to obey that order. He's been given a commission as a Continental Army colonel. He's raised a regiment of Canadians who go on to fight throughout the war. In fact, at the time that Arnold defects, there's only three regiments. I think the Blue Hens from Delaware, the Maryland Invincibles, and the Moses Hazen's Independent Canadian Regiment are the only three original regiments that have remained under the same chain of command for the entire war. But anyway, he's forced to obey Arnold's order, and he has to kill all his livestock, all his horses, and all his cattle. And then they proceed to the landing, where they're going to get on these boats to go up the St. John's up the Richelieu River to St. John. And when they get there, Hazen is given command. Hazen and his regiment are given command of holding the departure area. It's up to them to do that. And so when Hazen gets there, there's a Captain Scott, and we aren't given his full name at this point in time, just Captain Scott. Captain Scott, Hazen approaches Captain Scott because Captain Scott has got a whole bunch of plunder. He's got furniture and brassware and artwork, all those things. Almost everything on the list that the congressional delegation told Arnold and the military commanders that they could not take from the Canadians. That taking this stuff would ensure that Canadians never came on side. But they've done it. And Scott has all this stuff, and he tries to hand it over to Hazen for Hazen to be in command of as commander of this departure area. And he wants Hazen to take authority for it. And Hazen won't. He won't do it because he knows what the order was from Continental Congress. And he's a good officer. and he proves himself. There's a lot to be said about Moses Hazen, but he was a good military officer. So he won't take command of it. He won't take authority over this plunder that Scott has assembled, essentially on the beachhead. They're waiting for a departure. It's kind of a Dunkirk situation. They're trying to get everybody off of there as fast as they can, and Hazen's going to be the last guys on the boats to leave, and he won't take command of this stuff. And Scott goes back to Arnold and tells Arnold that Hazen won't take it over. And Arnold goes and confronts Hazen and says, "Hey, you've got to take command of this. This isn't Scott's authority. I entrusted Scott with this stuff, and you need to take over it and ensure its safety and to make sure it gets safely back to Fort Ticonderoga." And Hazen realizes that this is Arnold's plunder. Arnold's stealing this against the direct orders of Continental Congress. He's stealing this and taking it back to Fort Ticonderoga. And the reason for this is going to become clear on our next episode. But Hazen tells Arnold, no, plundering was banned by Continental Congress. You haven't given proper chits for this stuff. You've got no receipt books for it. I'm not taking command of it. This is outside of my authority, as a military officer. And it looks like, if you read the correspondence, it looks like Hazen gets a mind to tell Philip Schuyler. In fact, and I'm sure he did informally tell Philip Schuyler that Arnold was plundering. But before that could get through, Arnold presses charges against Moses Hazen for disobeying a command to take over this plunder and for plundering himself, which, of course, Hazen isn't doing. He's just killed off all his livestock. Hazen has complied with these valid orders. So anyway, they get all the way back down to Fort Ticonderoga. It's the beginning of July. Arnold files a formal charge with General Gates, Horatio Gates, who is later going to be Arnold and Gates are going to later have, depending on who you listen to, a confrontation at Saratoga. So this is the start of the bad relationship between Gates and Arnold. Arnold presses charges against Moses Hazen, and Gates is left holding the bag. How to diffuse this situation. And Hazen. Arnold's telling everybody that Hazen's plundering and Hazen's disobeying orders. And now Hazen wants the court-martial. He wants the chance to clear his name because it's out there in public among the officers who are all now back at Fort Ticonderoga. So Gates gives permission for the court-martial. Actually, Philip Schuyler gives permission for the court-martial, excuse me. And Gates is left to assemble it. Gates doesn't spend too much time dealing with it because he's got a lot on his plate with the army coming south and trying to decide whether or not he's going to establish a defense at Crown Point. What's going to happen with all the soldiers that are now scattered up and down the shores of Lake Champlain and trying to collect them in the bateau. He's got a lot going on. Schuyler has a lot going on too because he's building a fleet down in Skenesboro and trying to assemble the carpenters and the logistical support necessary to build this fleet to defend Lake Champlain. So Arnold steps into this picture with his charges against Moses Hazen, and he's almost left to his own. So Arnold initially names himself as the lead prosecutor for Moses Hazen's court-martial, which is completely, it's illegal. You can't be both the person that's pressing charges and the prosecutor. Not only that, but Arnold wants to be called as a witness. You can't be the prosecutor. You can't give testimony as the prosecutor in a court-martial. But Arnold does it nonetheless. And he names Captain Scott as the recorder. And then Arnold picks officers from his own command to be the jury. It's 13 officers that are picked to become the jury. Arnold picks lieutenants and captains from his own command, people that are under his authority. Again, this is illegal. Not only that, but Moses Hazen complains. Moses Hazen he goes to Gates first, and he also writes to Schuyler at the same time saying, hey, this is an illegal court-martial. Arnold can't be the prosecutor. You can't have a witness being the recorder. And I'm entitled, I'm a field officer, I'm a colonel, I'm entitled to having field officers on the jury. They have to be. That's what the Articles of War say. It has to be. And of course, Schuyler agrees. He writes a letter to Gates. Gates has to has to form the court on his own. So Gates forms the court. He pulls all field grade officers. He's got a couple colonels, 3 lieutenant colonels, and the rest majors, who end up sitting on the board. And they're not from Arnold. Well, 2 of them are from Arnold's command, but that's fair because Gates has picked them, and so they're it's a homogenous mix of officers who are at Fort Ticonderoga at that point in time. Arnold steps back as prosecutor, and instead he appoints Captain Scott as the prosecutor. So this is the guy that's going to be a primary witness. And he does that because, in retrospect, he does it because now Scott can't testify that Arnold is the one that gave him the plunder in the first place. So Scott can't testify. So it goes to trial. Arnold stays intrinsically involved in it. He doesn't step back. Initially, the trial is scheduled for the 19th of July, but Arnold gets summoned by Philip Schuyler to go to Schuyler's residence. And so the trial is put on hold. Arnold's away from Fort Ticonderoga between 20th and 25th of July. Arnold apologists say that during this point in time, he went to Skenesboro to oversee the construction of the Champlain fleet. In fact, what really happened is Arnold passed through Skenesboro on his way to Schuyler's house on the way down, and then he passed through Skenesboro on the way back. He was only there for overnight for 2 days, 2 nights. And while he was there, he did write a couple letters. At Schuyler's insistence, he writes some letters backing up Schuyler's request for ship's carpenters, and for maritime supplies to finish out the fleet. Arnold, as someone who has owned ships and sailed in the Caribbean, Arnold is probably the best authority. It really was the best authority that they had at the time on maritime affairs. So Schuyler's writing these letters, making these requests, and Arnold covers those letters with identical requests to Continental Congress and to George Washington and to Governor Trumbull in Connecticut to get these supplies from the maritime stores in Connecticut. So that's all happening. Arnold returns on the 25th. The trial resumes on, I think, the 29th or 30th of July. It only lasts a couple of days. As soon as the testimony starts, Hazen calls Arnold calls his witnesses, which is a pretty short list, and then Hazen calls his witnesses, and Hazen whips out this directive from the commissioners in Montreal saying you're not supposed to take plunder, and it's a very short trial. The jury recognizes very quickly that Arnold has contrived these charges in order to keep his own name out of the mud. They realize it. They tell Gates that Arnold has become overly involved in the prosecution, and that he is not a dispassionate. I'm pretty sure that's the word they use. He was not a dispassionate observer of the trial, but rather he was intimately engaged in the trial, and that he was being insistent with them and issuing orders to the jury members, which of course is it's verboten. So the jury, not only does the jury exonerate Moses Hazen, but a few days after the trial is over, the jury writes a letter to Gates and Schuyler together, saying not only did we exonerate Moses Hazen, but General Arnold should be the one who was charged with these crimes, as it was very clear to us from the witness testimony that he's the one that had plundered Montreal. And of course, that blows the lid off the whole thing. Arnold has already become so frustrated with the jury that he has challenged them all to duels. He's arranged for this duel to happen. He's gonna fight all 13 of the jury members because he feels that they've besmirched his name, and things are getting out of control. And Arnold has become the great divider of the forces at Fort Ticonderoga, because he has promised his soldiers shares of the plunder. he's promised them things that are not within his power to do, and he's only promised it to the soldiers that were directly under his command and not to other soldiers. And of course, all of that is, the soldiers think he's great because of that. That they're going to get cut in for a share of the plunder from Canada, which of course is illegal. And in Arnold's defense, he may have been assembling this plunder before the congressional delegation. In fact, I'm sure that he was assembling this plunder before the congressional delegation went up there, but he didn't divest himself of it, and he probably made those promises before the delegation got up there as well. And we see that promise happen on the river too. As the initial Montreal garrison is retreating towards Quebec in the fall or winter of 1775, commanders offer soldiers a share of anything that they take off the British ships when they're captured, because they control the St. Lawrence at that time. So that promise in Arnold's, not to completely besmirch Arnold, that promise had existed before, but he should have divested himself of it when Continental Congress gave the order, and he did not. So it's tearing Fort Ticonderoga apart. So Arnold has already made one trip down to Skenesboro, on his way down to Schuyler's house at Schuylerville, which is due south of Skenesboro. Arnold has seen the fleet. He's written those letters on behalf of Schuyler, seconding Schuyler's request for maritime supplies and ship's carpenters. So Schuyler, Gates wants Arnold out of Fort Ty. He just wants Arnold to get out of there so that this divisive influence that's in Fort Ty stops wrecking their the camaraderie, the military discipline, their ability to prep for what they know is the British counter invasion that's going to come that fall under Carleton, and of course it does materialize in late 1776. And this goes on for from July 2nd to the beginning of early August. I think Arnold leaves Fort Ty, finally leaves on August 10th to go down to take command of the fleet at Skenesboro, and that's what Gates and Schuyler come up with. We'll get Arnold out of Fort Ty by making him the commander of the fleet. So they give him command of the Champlain fleet, and it's a logical choice. Arnold has experience in maritime affairs. He owns trading vessels. He has been on the seas himself as captain of his own vessel, and so he's a logical choice amongst everybody there at Fort Ty to be the commander of the Valcour fleet, and it has the plus of getting him out of Fort Ticonderoga. So they give him the command. He goes down to Skenesboro, I think on the 9th or 10th of August, and then he's back like 2 days later. He sails the fleet back to Fort Ty, and yeah, this fleet. He comes back to Fort Ty and ties up there, and Gates, Schuyler, the other generals and senior colonels who, we modernly talk about senior colonels versus telephone colonels. They had the same problem back then. They had guys who were really colonel and guys who were lieutenant colonels, but you had to call them colonel on the telephone. So they had the same problem. So they had senior colonels, generals all meet in what they call in their council of war, where they devise the plan for the defense of Lake Champlain, and of course they devise the plan for Valcour Island there. And it's Gates' plan. He's the one that comes up and nominates Valcour Island as the place where the row galleys of the American Navy on Lake Champlain can hide behind Valcour Island, and the British would have difficulty reaching upwind to them, so the Americans would have the advantage behind Valcour Island. And the advantage was that it was shallow there, as well as the British fleet would have to sail south of them before they were visible. So the thought was that the American row galleys, because of their ability to propel themselves with oars, would have an advantage over the British sailing fleet. So they go. Arnold leaves. A few days later, he sails up to Valcour Island, and basically, he doesn't have the whole fleet. I think he sails north with 12, and eventually ends up with a total of 16 vessels up there to fight the Battle of Valcour Island. So he's following orders, and he's doing well. And I have note his stand at Valcour Island, at the actual fighting of the battle at Valcour Island, was valiant. But in the overall big scheme of things, Arnold gets way too much credit for saving Fort Ty in the summer of 1776. The real credit goes to Schuyler. Schuyler started building the Champlain fleet in January or February, early February of 1776, and he does it off of his own volition. He doesn't wait for orders or anybody. He recognizes that if we're going to control Lake Champlain, we have to have a fleet there. And these rogue galleys, he's taken a plan that was used fairly commonly at other locations in America for the plan for these vessels. Starts building the rogue galley fleet, and really by the time Arnold gets involved in late July, the fleet has really come together, and they're just waiting for these maritime, the ropes for rigging, tarred ropes for rigging and sails, and some hardware to finish off the last few vessels of the fleet. And what's happening here is the British get intelligence that Schuyler is building this fleet at the south end of the lake. And the British realize, Carleton in Canada realizes that in order to counter this growing and significant American fleet, that he needs to have a fleet as well for Lake Champlain. But his problem is he's above the St. Lawrence. And because of the falls on the Richelieu River, you can't get ships from the St. Lawrence into Lake Champlain, and vice versa. So he's got no way to build ships in Canada and get them into Lake Champlain. The ships have to be built south of the falls. So he wrote letters to the British government, to Lord North, explaining the situation. And the British commissioned 22 ships to be built in England or in Britain. They're built down in Portsmouth. And the ships are completed, and the parts are numbered and labeled, and then disassembled. And then they're loaded on bigger ships, because these are relatively small, brigs and schooners that are going to Lake Champlain. They take them apart, load them on bigger ships, and send them over to Quebec. And they get there, in the late summer of 1776. And then they're they're taken up to Montreal by ship. They're unloaded up the Richelieu River, drawn on carts up to Fort St. John, and then they're reassembled there. So this takes a lot of time. Carleton's not ready to set sail with his fleet until end of September of 1776. And so when the Battle of Valcour Island happens, it's kind of the culmination of these two fleet building exercises that have happened at the opposite ends of the lake. And so what saves Lake Champlain for the Americans in the fall of 1776 is the winter. And the only reason they get to the winter is because Schuyler, way back in January, the previous winter, had decided to start building this fleet. And it demands a counter response from the British, and they take all summer to assemble that counter response. The Battle of Valcour Island really only takes up 2 or 3 days. You have the battle itself, and then they kind of cease fire the first night, and then Arnold, very cleverly and miraculously almost, withdraws himself in the dead of night with muffled oars. They're able to row away south, and by the time the British wake up the next morning, they're in a chase mode, and they have to chase Arnold down the lake. Arnold ends up losing all but 3 of the gunboats that he's got. He himself has to beach on the American side, on the Vermont side of Lake Champlain, kind of near the mouth of the Onion River, I think, or maybe it's Otter Creek. I don't remember exactly. Anyway, and has to march the rest of the way south. So the real credit for the saving of Lake Champlain should go to Philip Schuyler for having the thoughtfulness and the foresight to order the development of the Champlain fleet. Arnold, and I agree, Arnold fought it brilliantly. And as someone who has been in a field command and had to make similar decisions to what Arnold made, I have to give him full credit for the way he fought the battle and skillfully extricated himself and most of the force from from what surely would have been certain capture, if not death. But that brings us to the end of that second episode, and the takeaway here is Arnold's alienation of Philip Schuyler and General Gates has already started, and it starts because of the trial of Moses Hazen, and he's alienated most of the American officers who are also at Fort Ticonderoga at the same time. By the way, Captain Scott, we later learn is John. His name is John Bud Scott. He was a captain from Maxwell's infantry regiment from New Jersey. And just a few weeks after Hazen's court-martial, John Bud Scott was stripped of his command and discharged for plundering from the Continental Army. He was accused of having soldiers on his regimental roster who did not exist, and for claiming pay for soldiers that did not exist, and claiming pay for soldiers who had been killed or by in battle or by disease. He was convicted of that and discharged from the Continental Army. So that brings us to that second shovelful of dirt that Arnold's that hole he's digging for himself has gotten one shovelful deeper.
That's you can't take away from his personal courage. It's just interesting that he goes so far in both directions, right? Like personally, his courage seems to be.
Yeah, and that's going to continue to shine through. He really is. He really is valiant. But Arnold has this idea about business, and that's the next thing we're going to talk about. Where he can't separate his personal reputation and his personal wealth from his military command. Modernly, we have rules about this stuff. You can't be a purveyor to the army. You can't sell stuff to the army. You can't plunder the enemy. We have not only in the laws of armed conflict, but in the Code of Military Justice, UCMJ, we have law. We have law about that, military law, and international law of armed conflict. And you just can't do the stuff that he was doing. But he's I kind of takes us to the next episode. But I wanted to give you a moment in case anybody has a question.
Just from Top Lobster asking the one who wanted to duel everyone and share his treasure with his men. So just he's our British companion for the night, and just talking about Benedict Arnold's, I guess, desire to take him to the Met and take care of specifically his people. So yeah, well, Benedict Arnold
he was known. Benedict Arnold's troops almost always liked him. Very, very rarely in his career was he disliked by the man in the field, by the private soldiers. Most of his reputational damage is done with the officers. The men in the field, he was viewed as a vibrant commander. He got a lot of people killed. His casualty rates as a Continental officer were very high, and in fact, as a British officer, his casualty rates were even higher. In fact, that's eventually why he gets pulled from active service with the British, was because in his raids in Virginia and starting off with New London, Connecticut, his casualty rates were so high the British they couldn't tolerate that his waste of men. So that's the official reason that or one of the official reasons why he was withdrawn from active command with British forces, was his casualty rates were so high. But the troops saw him as a vibrant commander, as someone who led from the front, and he certainly did, and supported him. It is a dichotomy. It's such a strange thing that he had this streak in him where his reputational, his desire to overcome his father's reputation, and then to overcome his own damage to his own reputation, are what lead him down this path.
It's just, it's hard to wrap your head around someone being so courageous and so self fulfilling, but also takes cares of his guys.
Yeah.
So it's like you'd almost expect him to be.
Well, the next episode is kind of dispels that a little bit, because now we're going to back up in time, and we're going to talk about Arnold's trek. Before the military, I see the question. What did he do? It just popped up on my screen. Amazing. That's great. What did he do before the military? So Arnold went into business as an apothecist, what we would modernly call a pharmacist. But really, that meant that he was a trader. He was a merchant. He did he did have a pharmacy. He did specialize in medications, a lot of which we would call snake oil. But he also had a very successful mercantile business. He did a lot of trade with the Caribbean. He did a lot of trade. Of course, some of his trade, I would say pretty close to half of his trade with the Caribbean was probably illegal. He was a smuggler. In fact, we know that he was a smuggler because some of his crew members, he didn't pay his crew members equitably, and some of his crew members lodged charges against him in Connecticut in the 1760s. Arnold took care of that by personally going out with his first mate and several other crew members and beating that man senseless. So he wasn't always good to his crew. But yes, he was a merchant. His trade with Canada prior to the war, excuse me, was in the lumber and horse trading business, which is why he was familiar with the northeastern part of the country. Yeah.
Let's see if I can figure out how to take this.
That's okay.
Question off.
Somebody will ask another question.
Oh, I got it. There you go. You're good.
So
Yeah,
we're going to backtrack a little bit, and we're going to talk about some of that. We're going to talk about Arnold's Hannibal march to Quebec. Arnold, of course, as we discussed, Arnold talks George Washington and giving him command of this through the wilderness trek to Quebec as that second front on the attack into Canada. It doesn't go particularly well. You guys probably know the story. They're trying to do this in a hurry because Montgomery's on his way north already before they even get this idea successfully percolating. Arnold hires a guy to build his boats to sail up the river or to row up the river, and the guy makes them out of green wood. And when they finally get on the river, the lumber is still contracting and the green wood shrinks, and of course the boats leak. And they have to stop and fix that. He hires guides who have never made the trek. The only maps that he had are horribly inaccurate. Arnold thinks the trip is about 180 miles. In reality, the route that he took with all the diversions ends up being almost 250 to 280 miles. He thinks it's going to take 20 days. It took 45. And by the time he gets up there, it's winter. It's right on the verge of winter. And in the Northeast, it's freezing cold. They're going through swamps. They're breaking through the ice. They're losing their ammunition and supplies through the ice. 40% of his force under Enos turns around and goes back. Because they think Arnold's not going to succeed in this. The force is just, at one point they eat one of the major's Newfoundland dog, because that's all they have left to eat. They're boiling soup out of their shoe leather. And that's it. So they go through this 45-day trek. And it's just, the conditions were abusive. You have a few of the men's wives accompany them on the trip. The soldiers themselves die, and there's two wives that make the trip, and their husbands have died along the way. It's horrible. It's really, he's called the American Hannibal for this. Hannibal's march over the Alps. He's called the American Hannibal for successfully engaging in this march. But the conditions are horrible, and he's lost a lot of men on the way, and they're starving when they come out on the north end of this and pop out on the St. Lawrence Seaway. And when they do pop out on the St. Lawrence Seaway, there on the seaway in front of them is Arnold's merchant vessel, the Peggy. Arnold had two wives. They're both named Peggy, so the ships are Peggy too. In fact, that's not the only Peggy ship that Arnold owns. And he's got a whole fleet of Peggys. Anyway, Arnold's merchant ship Peggy is waiting on the St. Lawrence Seaway, And, you would think a prudent commander would have put, some winter supplies on there for his men, maybe some fresh uniforms after marching, 45 days through the wilderness, maybe some food. But no, it's a merchant vessel. Arnold has 25 horses on board with their fodder and a cargo of rum, which sure the men were glad to see, but that's not the sustenance that they needed after being starving for, through their march. So this is October now, and Arnold's the St. Lawrence is getting ready to freeze over for the winter. To the west towards Montreal, as I said, the Americans had control of the upper. It looks lower on the map, but the St. Lawrence flows southwest to northeast. So the flow of the river is from Montreal to Quebec. So Montreal is upriver of Quebec, which is important when you have sailing vessels of this time and you have a current. So near Montreal, the Americans take possession of a couple British ships. One of them is named Gaspé, in relation to the ship that the Rhode Islanders burned in '74. But they take possession of the ship, the Gaspé, and in order to save the Gaspé from the winter in the St. Lawrence Seaway, because the seaway freezes solid. In fact, last winter, there were American naval vessels stranded in the St. Lawrence Seaway that could not get out. So the Americans take the Gaspé and they basically take all the soft goods off of her. They knock the bungs out of her scuppers and they sink her in the St. Lawrence Seaway. And then the following spring, they use air bladders to raise her back up. That way they avoid the ice. But Arnold doesn't do that. He's still got the cargo on board as winter approaches. And, as we just discussed in our prior episode, Arnold's plundering Montreal. And there's no reason for him to keep Peggy in the St. Lawrence Seaway other than to haul off that plunder that he's just accused most of the cases of disregarding. So he keeps Peggy in the St. Lawrence through the winter. Instead of sinking Peggy, because she's still got her cargo on board, instead of sinking her, he has the troops haul her up on an island, a rocky island that's in the St. Lawrence Seaway. And that's where she rides out the winter. They built some braces for her on the rocks. And of course, through the winter, as the wind hits and the ice is disheveled, she gets rocked back and forth. And by spring, her seams are sprung. So he sells it. He's already sold some of the horses to the Canadians, and he's selling the rum to his own troops, and he's turning a profit. But by the time spring runs around, Peggy's seams are sprung. She's not seaworthy anymore. Arnold doesn't have the Americans don't control facilities that would have been able to repair her. The facilities that he needed were across the river. They're basically at Point Levis, and which is not a seaport. Quebec is the seaport. That's where the dry docks are that he needs to have Peggy repaired, and they're in British control. He's not going to be able to get there. And British replacements are starting to arrive. The British are starting to sail ships up the St. Lawrence as the spring thaw hits, and Peggy is going to be lost. He's not going to be able to save her. He can't sail her. Even if he had repaired her, he couldn't sail her past the guns at Fortress Quebec because they can reach all the way across the river. So he's hosed. He's just, Peggy's doomed. So Arnold comes up with a plan to say, because at that point in time, officers are required to provide their own gear. When you take a commission as an officer, you are responsible for providing your own uniforms. You get an allowance for food, but you provide your own cook. You're going to pay for that. It comes out of your wages. And Arnold gets a table allowance because of his rank. So he gets a food allowance for both he and his officers. You're required to provide your own equipment, your own horse if you're mounted. So anything that you lose, anything that you've supplied that you lose in the course of a legitimate military operation, Continental Congress replaces that at their cost. So you provide the initial supply, and then Congress or the Continental Army are going to replace anything that you lose. So Arnold comes up with this idea of how he's going to save his investment in Peggy, and that is, in I guess it's late May or early June, Arnold packs a bunch of combustibles on board Peggy. Sets a train to the top deck, a powder train to the top deck, and then has her sails set and her wheel lashed, lights the fuse and pushes her off into the St. Lawrence Seaway. And the idea supposedly was that she would sail across the St. Lawrence Seaway and into the harbor of Quebec City, where maybe she would catch some of the British ships on fire. And of course, it's doomed from the outset for several reasons. First off, Peggy's leaking like a sieve, and with nobody aboard to man the pumps, she's already sinking the minute that they debark. Secondly, St. Lawrence has a current. It's a seaway, it's a river, and there's a current, and they can't calculate for that. You can't just push a ship off with the sails set in one means and expect that she's gonna make that hard left turn to sail into Quebec City Harbor. That's not realistic at all. And there's nobody on board to steer it. There's nobody, even if there's somebody steering, you have to tack to get into Quebec Harbor. And there's nobody there to change the set of the sails. So it's doomed from the outset. Plus the guns in Quebec City can range all the way across. And these are big guns. These are 24-pound, 32-pound guns that are mounted in Fortress Quebec. And before Peggy gets very far at all, they just blow her to smithereens. It just doesn't work. Plus, there's nothing there to take advantage of this, right? There's no army waiting to invade Quebec City if this is successful. There's no backup at all. It's just wishful thinking. So Peggy goes off to her demise. So this is in June of 1776. Now, the army still hasn't withdrawn from Quebec. Arnold's still needing, he's already met with the commissioners. The American army starts to withdraw, and then by July, they're back down on Lake Champlain. So early July, mid-July, they're at Fort Ty. And then Arnold immediately goes into his, the trial of Moses Hazen, which consumes him, which he can't extricate himself from. He's personally engaged in it. And then after that, he gets involved with the Valcour fleet. And that's through the end of October of 1776. And then after that, he no longer has, after the Valcour fleet is destroyed, he no longer has a command on Lake Champlain, and he leaves and goes back to Connecticut. His wife has died, and his sister is taking care of his three sons. And so he goes back to Connecticut to settle his personal situation. So he's fully engaged. And then in the spring of 1777, the British mount the Danbury raid. And actually, the Danbury raid is something that Arnold doesn't get enough credit for. He was outstanding in the Danbury raid. He was on leave because of his wife, and he was trying to take care of his family. And when the British land in Danbury, Arnold lived in New Haven. He gets on his horse and he responds to Danbury raid, and he's absolutely instrumental in helping drive the British back out of Connecticut. He should get more credit for that. And then in the fall of 77, well, actually in the summer of 1777, he gets assigned again. He's had no break. He gets assigned again to go back up to Stillwater, to Saratoga, assigned as General Gates' staff. And of course, while he's in the Saratoga command, he gets shot a second time in that leg, and and that's brutal. They want to cut off his leg, and he's adamant that they don't. But from October through May, he was in the hospital, or in hospital situations in private homes, near Schuylerville, just north of Albany, New York. And he's laid up, and in pain, serious pain, for most of that time. So the trouble is, it's not until 1779 that Arnold submitted his claim for reimbursement for expenses on his trip to Canada, which includes from the start of his march through Maine to the end of the Fort Ticonderoga campaign, so to Valcour Island. So that's August of 1775 through the end of October of 1776. So it's a little more, about 14 months worth of expenses that he's had this whole time. and he waits. He instead of submitting his travel voucher when he got back to Fort Ty in '76, he's involved in the Hazen campaign. And then instead of doing it while he's on leave, taking care of his family, he doesn't do it then either. And then in '77, he doesn't do it between Danbury. He's got several months between Danbury and getting assigned to Gates at Saratoga, but he doesn't do it then either. And then in 1778, once he's finally healthy, the British have withdrawn from Philadelphia, and now Washington assigns him, because he can't ride a horse anymore, he can't have a field command. Washington assigns him to be the commissary, military commissary at Philadelphia. So it's not until, I'd have to look at my notes, but I think it's July 20th of 1779 that Arnold submits his first travel voucher to Continental Congress. Now, before that, a couple of months before that, he submitted his travel voucher to the Continental Army, to the paymaster of the Continental Army. And the paymaster gets it. And you've got the picture pulled up there of what was submitted to Continental Congress. And if you look on the right-hand side, so on the left side, you see what was paid to Arnold, and on the right side, you see the justification for his expenses, right? So the two numbers have to match at the end. So if you look down the right side, you see a credit on his behalf for $2,666.60. They're not cents yet, because the continental dollar only has 90 pence in it, so they're pence. So that is the proverbial 2/3 dollar, by the way, that Continental soldiers got paid, was 60 pence. So you see that bill, that is for the brigantine Peggy. That is for Arnold's merchant ship that he sent into the St. Lawrence Seaway off his own volition, loaded with stores that he was going to try to sell to the Canadians. And he's billing Continental Congress for it. And his excuse is that it was used in a military purpose. It was used as a fire ship. We sent it off to destroy British shipping. And the paymaster for the Continental Army says, I can't pay you for that. We didn't order you to do that. That's something you did on your own. That was a risk of liability that you took as a merchant. That is not a military expense, nor are the horses that were on board, because you haven't provided any justification that those horses were used for a military expense. Now, the Continental Army did buy your rum, and that's why that's not on here as a bill. But they take umbrage with it, and they tell Arnold, you've got to submit this to Congress to get paid for those things which are not military expenses. So Arnold takes this whole thing and he goes to Congress. And what you see here is from April of 1780, and I sent this image because this is the synopsis of what Continental Congress deals with. So Continental Congress finally gets the bill in July of 1780. His first submission was in April of 1779 to the Continental Army. He ends up sending it to Congress in July of 1779, and then Congress has to figure this out. And there's several problems with this bill. Arnold doesn't have the receipts for everything that's on this bill. This is Arnold's bill. This is Arnold saying how I spent your money. He doesn't have receipts for it. He can't show where it turned out. And you can see on the left side there's a $3,333 debit for the Treasury office, where Arnold claims that he gave 1,000 pounds of specie of gold and silver to John Halstead, and Halstead is responsible for that. And Halstead comes back and says, no, you didn't. You didn't give me any money. If you gave me money, you have a receipt for it, because I would have signed one for that much money. I'm not taking money from Continental Army without a receipt. And Halstead says, no, I never got that money. And so there's this running argument between Arnold and Halstead about whether or not he ever actually got paid. And Halstead says, show me the receipts. And so Halstead goes in to the paymaster, to Continental Congress Department of Treasury, and they go through Arnold's folio. There's 4 witnesses there when they go through Arnold's folio, and sure enough, there's no receipt for this 1,000 pounds of specie money. So it's called out separately, because Arnold doesn't think it's part of his bill, but everybody else thinks it is. So in the end, So this languishes. It languishes. And Arnold's getting very public about the fact that Continental Congress owes him money. And they do. At the bottom, you can see the balance due to General Arnold. On the bottom right, you see balance due to General Arnold in specie of $2,328. There is no such thing as a specie dollar. There's an American dollar does not exist. We all know that the Americans coined a pewter dollar coin, but it never was put into circulation. In fact, the Continental Congress did not authorize that. That was done by a private mint. So when you see that in specie, what they're talking about is Spanish mill dollars. Those are doubloons that he wants to be paid in. And so the argument goes back and forth for quite a while. And Congress doesn't want to pay him for the horses. First off, Arnold wants an exorbitant amount for the horses. He wants like $15 or 15 pounds each for the horses. Congress says no. The going rate for a horse is 8 pounds. We're not going to pay you 15 pounds for 25 horses. And you have never shown us any indication that those horses were used for a military purpose. Why do we owe you for horses that you took up there as a merchant? And so what they say is, if you can get two other officers to sign off that these horses were used for a military purpose, if you can get 2 other officers to sign off that Peggy was used for a military purpose, we'll pay you for them. And they put the onus on Arnold. And of course, from our last discussion, you know that all the officers that Arnold served with, he's pissed them off. His whole plunder thing at Montreal, his court-martial of Moses Hazen, for the ones that still remember Fort Ty, they're all still upset with him. Arnold goes 2 years and can't get anybody to find that will sign a receipt agreeing that he used those horses or Peggy for a military purpose. Nobody will do it. And no evidence exists that he ever did. And you have a lot of private opinions about this because this has become very public, right? Arnold's, by the time this gets submitted, Arnold is the commissary of Philadelphia. And in 1779, Joseph Reed, the mayor of Philadelphia, is going to charge Arnold with criminal charges during his stay there. So Arnold's in the press, and it's all negative. He's got the Philadelphia criminal charges. He's got this bone of contention over back pay, travel receipts, if you will, with Continental Congress. But the truth of it is, he didn't submit the voucher to Continental Congress until the summer of 1779. By the time Congress pays it, this is essentially the pay voucher here that from April of 1780. But by the time Congress pays it, it really hasn't been that long, particularly when you consider that Arnold comes up short with his receipts. There's no real delay, artificial delay in Congress paying him. The delay is caused by Arnold's lack of records, and it's lack of records not for the nitty gritty of food being purchased for men or pay being paid to the men. It's not for those basics. It's for Arnold's personal merchant venture. It's for the horses and it's for the sloop, and it goes on. So he finally gets his check. Now, what's important to note about this is Arnold has request payment in specie. That means gold or silver, hard currency. He doesn't want.
Oh, why is he doesn't want? Okay, yeah.
Right.
He doesn't want to get paid out in the country he fights for.
No, this is April of 1780. Arnold's correspondence with the British started in May of 1779. He knows he's leaving. He doesn't want continental dollars. That's why he wants to be paid in gold and silver. He's already starting to liquidate his personal possessions and converting his personal property into gold and silver. And he's sending it off to British officers in New York. He's already transferring his wealth to Britain. He's already on the road to his defection, to his treason, and he's asking for his voucher to be paid in specie, not continental dollars. And so it's an amazing story here. And so that kind of brings us to the end of this episode. where Arnold's reputation, when you read the Arnold sort of what I call the Arnold apologist, the modern apologist, they view this as this tremendous delay in Arnold getting repaid for his expenses in Canada. But the reality is Arnold waited 3 years to submit the voucher. From 1776 until April of 1779, there was no voucher. Nobody was working on this. He hadn't even asked to be repaid. And then when he did ask to be repaid, he puts up a bunch of fraudulent expenses. And when Continental Congress finally did repay him, they paid him what was on this list right here. They finally agreed that they were going to pay him. You notice the horses are not on here. They finally agreed to repay him a depreciated price for Peggy, and they did pay him for her, but they never did pay him for the horses. In fact, Arnold, after this goes through in April, Arnold immediately writes back and appeals. Of course, he's in Philadelphia then, and so is Continental Congress. So these appeals happen very quickly. So Congress pays him, and they don't pay him in specie. Anyway, Congress pays him, and then he immediately appeals the horses. And there's a whole series. You can read all this stuff in the congressional journals. It's all spelled out in the congressional journals. It's very tedious to go through because it's not very well indexed, but it is indexed in the back of that year's congressional journal. You can go to that year, which is 1779 and 1780, and you can go in the index and look up Arnold's name, and almost all of those entries deal with his voucher payments. So you can see that it's very active. Congress isn't putting him off. They're continually asking him to provide proof of expense so that they can pay him. They're not delaying this. But the apologists are like, well, this is the reason that Arnold's defecting. Bullshit. It's just not. Arnold is aware of what's going on. He knows that he's not getting paid because of Peggy and the horses. He knew that. This isn't what's driving him to defect. And when the final voucher goes in, he's already asking to get paid in gold and silver because he already knows he's going to defect. Yeah, it's just a horrible episode. And of course, people know this. People in their time, he's asking Washington to help him get paid. He's asking Congress to help him get paid. He's writing letters to the Connecticut delegation. And of course, nobody in Connecticut, the Connecticut delegation and the Massachusetts delegation are already, they don't want anything to do with Benedict Arnold. He's already blown their trust. So he's not getting the support that he wants from Continental Congress. And in fact, in 1779, I think I mentioned already that he was nominated for to be the head of ordnance for the Continental Army, and his name is mysteriously scratched off the list of candidates. So he's becoming, and then the other thing that happens in the spring of 1880, of course, is the final episode that we'll talk about. But let's give people a chance to chime in with questions before we go there.
This was in when we were talking about ships being frozen in the St. Lawrence Seaway.
Yeah. I don't know if that's a dig or a compliment, but St. Lawrence is still pretty hard to navigate. There's lots of islands. Of course, there's the Thousand Islands, which are just to the west of Lake Champlain. Kind of north of the New York border modernly, and it is a hard seaway to navigate. But everybody knew that the St. Lawrence froze solid in the winter. There was no reason to leave Peggy in the St. Lawrence unless you weren't planning to use her the following spring to haul off plunder that you had captured in Montreal. It's the sole reason that it was there. Of course, Peggy sprung her seams and is not usable for that. So Arnold was forced to have that merchandise sent south towards Fort Ty if he was going to retain it. And of course he did that and got caught in the act.
Okay, so moving on to our
so the final episode that we're going to talk about is really Philadelphia, and we've really already started to broach some of that topic. So Arnold's bravely fighting Saratoga, and I didn't say anything about Arnold's activities at Saratoga itself. There's some new letters that have come forward in the last 7 or 8 years that suggest that maybe the relationship between Gates and Arnold at Saratoga wasn't as harsh as we originally believed that it was. You know, I don't know how much of that to believe because, you know, Arnold was pretty specifically sent there because Gates had just taken over from Philip Schuyler as the commander of the Northern Army. And of course, Schuyler and Washington were very close. Arnold and Washington were very close. So Arnold was kind of sent as Washington's man in camp, if you will, in Gates' camp. And Gates and Arnold had that really bad run-in over Hazen at Fort Ticonderoga. So their relationship was already strained before Arnold got to Saratoga. But Arnold's activity at Saratoga, you know, he although in the first Battle of Saratoga he wasn't actually on the field himself, he was smart enough to feed the fight. You know, he was a good officer in knowing that the engagement that was going on was to the American Army's advantage, and he continued to put troops into that fight to keep it advantageous to the Americans. And you know, it really ended up as one of those Pyrrhic British victories, because technically they held the field, but they lost a lot more soldiers than the Americans did. But Arnold was smart enough to feed that fight, and doing so was much to our benefit. And then in the second battle, you know, there's different stories about what happened with Arnold in the second battle of Saratoga. You know, but one thing's for sure is that he did ride his horse to attack the redoubt. Of course, he shifted. The reason that he rode out onto the field, you know, in his own words, was to shift the focus of the American advance from one redoubt to another. When you read the other officers' reports of the same engagement, the commander, I think it was Enoch Poor, had already recognized that that first redoubt had become abandoned by the British and was not going to be a factor in the battle, and they had already made the decision to move on to the second redoubt to shift the focus. So, you know, Arnold may not have understood that when he rode out, but he certainly did, and it was certainly extremely brave. He was almost, if not the first person into the redoubt. He was very close to it, and of course, you know, the bullet that shattered his leg continued through his leg and killed his horse. So not only did it shatter his leg, but when the horse went down, it landed on top of that leg, and he was trapped underneath the horse until enough troops came to lift the horse off him. It was horrible. You know, he was just about to get a bayonet as a coup de grace from an enemy soldier when American troops, somebody on the American side, shot that guy and saved him. So, you know, it was very, very, very close to being killed there. In fact, he was very close to dying after the battle, just from the results of the wound. That he had a kind of wound that not very many people at that time survived. Most people would have had an amputation. Arnold was insistent that he not be amputated. In fact, he ordered somebody to stand over him while he was getting medical care because he was afraid he was going to pass out, which he did. And that person's orders was that if anybody got out a bone saw, he was to shoot them. So and honestly, not amputating his leg may have saved him, because those kinds of amputations didn't go well in that time period. So, you know, I don't want to take anything away from him. He was a valiant soldier. But unfortunately, he was obnoxious and he alienated too many people. And that's what happened in Philadelphia. So he goes into the hospital, comes out of medical care in May of 1778. You know, he's in there for really an extended period of time. And the war went on. You know, it was passing him by, and he was getting increasingly frustrated from it. You know, he had all that time when he could have done his travel voucher, and he didn't. Anyway, he comes out of the hospital in May of 1778, and he's not able to ride. So he goes home for a while, and he's getting very antsy about the fact that the war is passing him by, and he's getting shelved, and he's afraid that his laurels have been tarnished, and he's not going to get it. He's not going to come out at the end of the war with the laurel, you know, with the personal praise that he believes he deserves. And he's correct. You know, at that point in time, he's got the march to Quebec, and he's got Valcourt Island. Danbury kind of goes largely unnoticed, but he's also, you know, now he's been wounded yet again at Saratoga, and he comes out of Saratoga not getting a lot of initial credit, because Gates doesn't mention him, you know, and he doesn't get that credit. In fact, that's the big fallout between he and Gates, is that Gates doesn't mention him in his report from the first battle. So he's really getting antsy to get back in, but he can't ride. Everywhere he goes by carriage. And Washington wants to use him. Washington thinks that he can be a motivating force, and Washington has largely been separated from Arnold's challenges with fellow officers, because all of Arnold's misdeeds have been in a theater where Washington wasn't in charge. Washington wasn't in charge at Ticonderoga. Washington wasn't in charge in Quebec. Washington wasn't in charge in Montreal. Washington wasn't in charge on Valcourt Island. And Washington really wasn't in charge of a military commissary in Philadelphia. That was really a Continental Congress. So Washington has been sort of on the outside looking in at this, and hasn't seen this alienation firsthand. So he reassigns Arnold. He makes use of Arnold by assigning him as the commissariat for the military commissariat for Philadelphia after the British withdraw in May of 1778. So Arnold gets there, I think, in the end of June or beginning of July of 1778, and he immediately moves into the mansion that General Clinton had just left, or General Howe and General Clinton had just left when they withdrew from Philadelphia. So it was a loyalist mansion that they had expropriated for their headquarters. Arnold moves into the same place, and he starts going around to loyalist houses and confiscating the furniture and furnishings of loyalist houses in Philadelphia. And he starts dating this, gets romantically interested in 17-year-old Peggy Shippen, who is the daughter of a loyalist, and in fact is a loyalist, and in fact now we know is on the British payroll. And he's getting involved in all this loyalist activity, and then in early 1779, so he's been there for about 6 months, and he's throwing these balls, and he's inviting loyalists to the balls, and there's dancing, there's alcohol is flowing, and he's really living well above his paycheck, and in the spring of 1779, it comes out that Arnold's been expropriating this loyalist furniture, and he's got a correspondence going with the former officers who were living in Philadelphia during the British occupation. They're now in New York City, occupying New York City, and he's got a correspondence going on with them, and he is selling them the furnishings of the houses in which they lived when they were occupying Philadelphia. So he's confiscated these loyalist goods, and now he's selling them to British officers. And he's using Continental Army wagons, and Continental Army Teamsters to deliver these goods to New York. And these guys are actually, some of them are even in uniform, in Continental uniform, when they're going through the lines to deliver this stuff. And the delegates to Continental Congress get word of this, but they don't want it to be Continental Congress thing. So they suggest that the mayor of Philadelphia, Joseph Reed, direct his complaints to the Continental Army. And of course, the Continental Army means George Washington. So Reed does. And Washington looks at it and says, no, some of these charges are civil charges. Theft of goods is a civil charge. And, illegally selling goods to the enemy, that's a civil charge. That's not a military charge. So and Washington then officially refers it to Continental Congress. And Congress spends several months, and again, the journals of Continental Congress outline this, their discussions about this, and the to and fro that happens between the committees in Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania committees in Philadelphia, Continental Congress, and Washington. And it's a ping pong ball. It's a tennis match. And the ball goes back and forth over the net several times before Continental Congress finally looks at the 8 charges that have been leveled against Arnold, and they say, well, one of these isn't even a real charge. It's morally corrupt, but it's not a real charge. And they use pretty much that language, that it's morally undignified, but it's not a legitimate criminal charge. So they throw one out, and then they say, well, 3 of these are civil crimes, but the other ones are military crimes. But they're crimes against Pennsylvania. So we think that this court-martial should be a Pennsylvania militia court-martial. Besides, he's the commissary of Philadelphia. So that's what happens. He ends up having a court-martial. And he claims to want the court-martial because he wants to clear his name. And in the end, he gets a hung jury on all the charges but one. So the jury, when you read it, the jury's like 11-2, 10-3. I think the best he gets is like 9-4. But it has to be unanimous. The only one they're unanimous on is the charge of using the Continental wagons to transport private merchant goods. It's the only one that he is convicted on. We look at it today and we see all those other charges, and you just, it's all illegal. He doesn't get convicted on them. He gets a hung jury on 6 of the 7 charges. The 8th charge it goes through, and the jury recommends that Congress administer the punishment. And of course, Congress doesn't want to do it. Congress just wants Arnold to go away. So Congress makes George Washington do it. They make George Washington issue his punishment, and George Washington gives him the least possible punishment that he possibly could. He writes him a letter of reprimand. He reprimands him for inappropriately using wagons to transport his personal goods, and I think the Teamsters were lumped into that. So he gets this really delicate letter of reprimand, and even within the letter of reprimand, the second paragraph says, even though I'm saying this, you are still a very valuable and prestigious military officer whom I value in my service, and I hope will continue in my service, in the service to your country. And it is very delicately worded, and it's hardly anything. But once again, it's a hole that Arnold has dug himself, and it's the final shovelful of dirt in this presentation of Arnold to the American public and to the other officers that are in the American Army. And by this point, the newspapers have carried these stories. They know what the charges. Everybody in America knows what the charges against Arnold are. And his reputation as the Hannibal of Quebec, his reputation as the hero of Valcourt, are all hopelessly tarnished by these episodic misadventures where he's just dug these holes for himself. There's nobody in Massachusetts or Connecticut or New York that are in the Continental Congress delegations that are still supporting him. Amazingly, the delegates from Connecticut and Massachusetts never go public with Fort Ticonderoga. They try to cover up as best they can to keep it out so that it looks like there's no dissension amongst the colonies. At the outset of the war, they can't afford that dissension. They need to unite the colonies. And they never make it public. But those who are intimately involved know. And of course, James Easton and John Brown continue after Benedict Arnold for years afterwards. Arnold and Easton have a further run-in at Fort Ticonderoga. Arnold actually bashes him on the head with a sword and kicks him in the butt, and charges him with cowardice for failing to duel him when dueling is expressly forbidden in the Army. Easton did the right thing, but they have a run-in. Arnold's persona non grata with so many senior officers in the Continental Army by the end of the war that his reputation is hopelessly sullied, and there's no chance for him because of his leg, because of his reputation. He really perceives no chance for him to gain a command that is going to get him the laurels that he feels he is entitled to, that will raise his status after the war is over. So he obviously had already come to that conclusion by June of 1779 when he starts his correspondence with the British. This is just after his marriage to Peggy Shippen at that point. He's made his decision to go over, and of course, we all know what happens at West Point. So this kind of adds up. We talk about the Arnold apologists are talk about how upset George Washington was that that Benedict Arnold, his chosen guy, turned traitor on him. That George Washington took it kind of personally, but it wasn't just because of what Washington had done for him, or Arnold's exploits as a general. It was because Washington had covered him so many times. He basically had dismissed all these incriminating activities as little piquant picadillos, instead of treating them with the seriousness that modernly would have gotten a general or any officer cashiered much sooner. But Washington had stuck with him because of his battle acumen.
It's interesting to note too that Washington is there for him. He basically pulls him out of this huge trouble he's in, and he gives him West Point.
Yeah.
And you would just almost expect that it'd be like, "Thank you so much, boss. Like, Roger,
Yeah.
like I will be on best behavior. You saved me."
Yeah.
So like,
yeah, and not only that, but Arnold the timing of Arnold's defection is designed so that the British troops are going to take over West Point, and Arnold's timing it so that the British are going to do that when George Washington is there. Yeah, that's the timing of Arnold's defection is being timed. He's giving them information about George Washington's comings and goings from West Point. Washington's traveling back and forth from Philadelphia and New York, the lower Hudson, to New England, doing general business, because of Newport, Rhode Island, and Arnold's giving those dates of Washington's transits and when he plans to be there to the British, so that the British can actually conduct their takeover of West Point while Washington is there. And that becomes obvious from the documents that were captured in John Andre's boot. That he's got, John Andre had the schedule, Washington's planned itinerary for West Point, and also had the diagrams for the fortifications at West Point, which Arnold had delayed in completing, so that they weren't going to be complete when the British invaded. So the personal betrayal of George Washington by Benedict Arnold was full and complete, and Washington, that's essentially why Washington sends people to infiltrate Benedict Arnold's command in Virginia, to try to snatch him away. And in fact, John Champ goes to Boston, to New York, before Arnold sails for Virginia, and they insert John Champ as a spy into New York. He inserts himself into Arnold's American Legion, which Arnold is going to command, and becomes kind of a personal servant to Benedict Arnold. Champ comes up with a plan to kidnap Arnold, which is supposed to happen, I think, on December 19th of 1780, and Arnold, the morning of December 20th of 1780, Arnold gets his orders to sail the next day from New York down to Virginia, and of course that frustrates the kidnapping plan, which is all laid in place. Yeah.
I think it would be. I guess one thing real quick is that we'll have to come back and talk about. I feel like most stories of Arnold end with West Point, and it wasn't until 5 years ago when I got into Revolutionary War history reenacting that I realized, oh no, he came back and just started attacking the country he had fought with. So
yeah,
as much as you can be,
he comes to Virginia and starts raiding in Virginia, captures, takes Richmond, burns Richmond, burns all the stores of Petersburg, and then goes back to Hampton Roads. He abuses his privilege. He had prior to his defection, he had a correspondence with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson revealed to him the intelligence plan, the top intelligence apparatus that was established at the mouth of the Chesapeake. Arnold exploits that when he first arrived in the Chesapeake and captures the main, what Jefferson called his intelligencers, the main guys that are in Hampton Roads doing that, and because of that, successfully gets to Richmond. Then, after Phillips comes down to Richmond, and of course Phillips and Cornwallis join forces, Arnold's relieved of command, goes back to New York, and then gets assigned when the British realized that Washington wasn't just faking his way around the southern side of New York City, but is actually marching to Yorktown to come get Cornwallis. British try to establish a distraction that will pull him off, and they send Arnold on his raid of New London, Connecticut, his hometown, and that's where the atrocities at Fort Griswold happen. And Arnold was just hideous to his former country.
Yeah, that's
And
just.
he didn't really change. Arnold fought 8 more duels in his lifetime after leaving Continental service, and 4 of them were in Canada. The British gave him land in Canada as part of his deal, and he goes and tries to set up a lumber mill, a lumber operation in Canada, in New Brunswick, and alienates people up there. They come to burn him out of his house and home. He ends up getting almost charred and feathered, but narrowly escapes. He challenges people to duels up there. He challenges people to duels in England, and finally, in 1801, he dies, not quite destitute. And of course, Peggy dies just a few years later of either ovarian or cervical cancer. She did a pretty masterful job putting his fortune back together using the money that not only he got, but she got from the British government. This is how we know that she was on the British payroll. She got a pension from the British government of £500 a year. That would be the modern equivalent of about $450,000 a year. So she wasn't just a bit player in this big scheme. She definitely was on the British payroll.
Yeah, and that was just from your article. You mentioned that $695,000 in today's money, that they eventually pay him out for it too, after he moans and complains, and he makes this as they do pay him out.
Yeah, he comes out of it, and Peggy ends up being the one that pays off all his debts. He starts his lumber business in New Brunswick goes into debt. He tries to put his sons in charge of it, but he's alienated the people so badly that he eventually just has to flee the country, and it's taken over by locals. And he owes them money. So Peggy's the one that eventually pays off all of his debts.
Well, it's been fascinating conversation. Just the courage takes him so close to the sun, and then his greed just
it
sinks.
really is a Daedalus a moment. Icarus.
Yeah.
The wax melts and he plummets, and unfortunately he's the one holding the match.
Well, Jim, if you'd
I kind of apologize to your fans that this has been gone on so long. I hope people enjoyed it.
No, the whole purpose is people will listen to this as a podcast, and if you're working 8 hours a day behind a desk, this is nothing. You still have 5.5 hours left to work. So it was fascinating history.
Lengthy commutes on the interstate, so maybe it'll be a good companion on the interstate.
Oh, that's exactly. And then I'll link to your article because you wrote the article and some of your other articles, and just looking at all the other stuff you've done. We'll have you back on to break out the whole revolution.
This is far more in depth than I've ever gone into in an article. We really told the whole story here. This is when you're looking at the modern versions of the Arnold story, they don't tell you this part, and they don't give you the feel for why Arnold was ended up being ostracized by his fellow officers, and how that ostracization fed into his defection, because he really was out of options with the Continental Army. He wasn't going to get what he wanted. Brave man, critically flawed.
Well, Jim, if you have anything else to say as you close out, and then we have no real questions to get to, so whatever your closing, I guess, argument or statement will be.
That was it. Well, thank you, everybody. Pleasure being with you, Luke.
All right, sounds good. I'll end the stream, then we'll go backstage. So
okay.
Hold on a second.